Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program, interviewing John Beauchamp, 565 Hamlin Street, Wabash, Indiana, Wednesday, September 11th, 1974. John, the first question I'm going to ask is, tell me about your own birth date and place and your parents and the background on your parents and so forth.
Well, as far as my birth, I was born on July 29th, 1909 in Andrews, Indiana, a block east of the Methodist Church in Andrews, and on the northwest corner in the upstairs southeast room. As far as my background, my ancestry, I never studied family history. We had a joke in the family that my brother tried to trace the history of the Beauchamps, and he got back to a sheep thief and quit. Now, there's a story about that. The alleged sheep thief was my great-great-grandfather, Russell Beauchamp, who was a Quaker and lived in South Carolina. And it was always said that he was expelled from the Quaker church for taking a lamb, which was quite true if you realize that by taking, he took her for his wife. He married a girl named Lamb. He was a birthright Quaker. That was his parents were Quakers. He was born into the church, and she was a convert. And according to the rules of the Quaker church, a birthright Quaker was not allowed to marry any except a birthright Quaker. So they expelled him from the church. Now, I did see a family history one time, and it mentioned that. It also showed that he had 7 brothers, and of the 7, 4 of them were expelled from the Quaker church for marrying contrary to discipline. So my wife and I decided the Quaker girls didn't have it on the ball at that time. Now, another interesting thing about that was we have, or at one time did have, the wedding certificate of their wedding. And they were married in the Quaker church. They had no preachers. So they published the banns. They put a notice on the door that they would be married at a certain time, and people came there, and they said the vows themselves. And at the end of the ceremony, everybody there signed it as a witness. And I think there were 28 people who witnessed their marriage. It always seemed interesting to me that they allowed them to be married in the Quaker church and then immediately kicked them out because they did marry. I don't know anything really about my great-grandfather. My great-great-grandfather came to Indiana. That would have been sometime, I think, in the 1820s. My great-grandfather, the only thing I know about him was that he was a cabinet maker, and we have some items of furniture which he made. We have a gate-leg table, solid walnut, that we think is a beautiful thing that he made back around 1840. We're not sure of the exact date. Now, my grandfather, John Beauchamp, was born around Andrews, and I know very little about him. They lived in LaFountain, I believe, at the time my father was born in 1874. And shortly after that, they moved to Marion. I've heard Dad tell about being at the dedication of the Marion Courthouse, which I think was about 1880, around that, 79 or 80. Dad tells how his mother had made new pants for him, and they weren't sewed very well. The thread wasn't very good, and they split out while he was watching the ceremony. But one of the most important things to the family was when Dad was 8 years old. He was living in Marion, and he went across a railroad bridge, which his parents had told him not to cross. And while going across, he slipped and bruised his right shin. And it became infected. But he didn't tell his parents that it had become infected. He told them nothing about it because he thought they would punish him, I suppose. And they didn't know about it until it was very badly infected with what they called decay of the bone. Today they call it osteomyelitis. And the next year, when Dad was 9 years old, they had to take the leg off. That's the only cure they knew, was to take it off as high as they could and hope they got all the infection. And they took it off as near the hip as they could. That, of course, had a great effect on the family. Now, Dad, at one time he had an artificial leg, but I never knew him to use it except once. When I was 6 years old, he dressed up as Santa Claus at Christmas, and he put the leg on so we wouldn't know it, but I never saw him use it. Legs were not very satisfactory. They were heavy and clumsy, and his leg was also very high that it was not satisfactory. And I expect they lacked money to buy a wooden leg. So Dad learned to use one crutch, and he became very adept at using one crutch. I've said many times that I never saw anything that a man with two legs could do that Dad couldn't do, and usually do faster. He couldn't keep it up very long. But for example, he could run very fast for 100 yards, faster than many men with two legs. And he was a good swimmer, but he couldn't keep those things up very long. I've heard the story many times. In 1887, when Dad was 13 years old, his father put the family in a wagon and they drove to Nebraska, where they homesteaded. They had a soddy house. It was dug out down into the ground, and they used the sod to make the walls and the ceiling. And as I got it from listening to him, it wasn't a very satisfactory living quarter. And they raised a lot of corn, but they had no way of getting it out, and the result was they had an enormous amount of corn and nothing else. And for a year they ate practically nothing except corn. They burned corn to cook their meals. They burned corn to heat the soddy in the winter time. And it was a rough time. Then, to cap things off, my grandfather contracted tuberculosis, became very ill. There was a time, Dad has told me, I don't remember whether he was 14 or 15, but the family, his mother and father and his younger sister and brother, and he was the sole support. He was shoveling corn on one leg, 15 years old, at 50 cents a day. Well, my grandfather got much worse, and finally grandmother loaded the family into a wagon, and they drove back to Andrews, frankly, for grandfather to die there. And shortly after his death, grandmother got tuberculosis, and she died within a couple of years. So father was the oldest one in the family. He was about 17 then, but he had an uncle, Uncle Simon. He was known as S.S. Beauchamp in Andrews. He lived there for 90 years, was widely known. Uncle Simon in looks always reminded me of Benjamin Franklin. And he was a very good man, an extremely religious man. I think he had a deeper faith than any man I've ever been around. He never preached to anybody. He just lived his faith. On that I remember he and Aunt Lou were married for 65 years, and she died. I thought she had cancer of the liver. I thought he'd go before she did. But he didn't. She died, and he went on. It was a couple of years after that. He said something when I was there that made me realize to Uncle Simon, Aunt Lou was in heaven. It was more real to him than if she were in New York City. And he was going to go there and be with her just as soon as God decided it was time. Well, anyway, Uncle Simon did a great deal for Father. He had a family and was not very well off, couldn't help a great deal financially. But one thing that he did do, he insisted and convinced Father that he should go to college. Dad went to Terre Haute State Normal, now Indiana State. And at one time when he ran for politics, when he ran for county auditor, on his card it said he had 4 years of college education, but I'm sure he did not graduate from Terre Haute State Normal. And he taught. He'd teach in the winter time in a one-room school and then go back in the summertime to Terre Haute. And it was during that time that he started selling maps and atlases. And he was He was a great salesman and a great trainer of salesmen. As a matter of fact, about the time I was born, he was the highest paid trainer of salesmen that Rand McNally had ever had. May give you an idea, at that time, $10 to $15 a week was very good pay for a man. And Rand McNally was paying my father $100 a week, all expenses and all sales, to train salesmen. So he was good at that. But he didn't like it. He hated the road. He would be gone for weeks at a time and not get home, and he was a home man. And but he liked teaching, and apparently, well, I'm sure he was an excellent teacher. I know because of the way he taught me when I was a boy. But a story about his teaching. In the one-room schools, you'll remember it was quite the thing for the students to drive the teacher out. And there was a school at Rock Hill. Now that's on Highway 24, cut through Rock Hill, just east of the Wabash County line, a mile or two. It's just west of where 105 comes south into 24, and you can see the Rock Hill. If you look at the side of the road, you can tell where it is. Years afterward, there was a barber at the Indiana Hotel named Mike Grant, and I used to go down there and get my hair cut. And Mike Grant was a student there when Dad taught, and this is the story which he told. He said that they had driven the teacher out, 3 teachers the year before. It always seemed to me rather foolish of the trustee to send Dad out there. Dad was a very slender man with only one leg and a crutch. He weighed 125 pounds, although if he'd had the other leg, he would probably have weighed 160. But my Grant said there was a big German boy, 6 feet tall, 19 years old, weighed close to 200 pounds. He was the ringleader in driving the teacher out. He said they were gathered in the school, and each one would go over and kick to see how high he could kick, and then draw a line with his chalk and write his name, so that's how high he kicked. He said about that time Dad came in the door and saw what they were doing and told them to stop. And the big German boy walked over and kicked and started to draw his line. But he said Dad took the hold of the end of the crutch, vaulted across the room on the crutch, dropped the crutch, and hit the boy all in one motion. And it cold-cocked him. And then he said Dad was down just pummeling the life out of him, and the boy decided he'd had enough, and he said Dad got up then and suggested anybody else wanted to settle things now. This was the time, and from then on he had no further trouble. It was about, I think it had been about 1899 that Dad was sent to teach at the Maple Grove School. That was about 3 miles north and east of Andrews. At that intersection, there was the school on one corner. The building's still there, by the way. A sawmill is using it. I stopped there not too long ago. That was on the northwest corner. On the northeast corner was the small Quaker church and a cemetery. The cemetery is still there, of course, and I have quite a few relatives buried in that cemetery. But on the southeast corner was the farm of George Mason, who was my grandfather, mother's father. And while Dad taught there, he lived in the home of my grandfather, George Mason, roomed there. Apparently there wasn't any romance between him and Mother at that time. That didn't come until somewhat later. It was shortly after that the Huntington City schools wanted a principal for one of their grade schools. And they asked the county superintendent about the teachers who were teaching over the county. And he told them that, without a question, Ward Beauchamp was the finest teacher in the county. But he said, I would not recommend him for a principal's position because he has only one leg. And Dad found out about that, and that was the end of his teaching, because he would never do anything where he thought the leg would prevent him from the fullest success. So I think he was back selling maps and atlases, and it was 2 or 3 years later, I think, before he and Mother started any serious courtship. They were both somewhat older than most. They were married when Dad was 30. That'd be in 1904, and Mother was 29. Now, to go back on Mother's side, they were Quakers. Her grandfather came from Pennsylvania sometime in the 1830s. His name was Aaron Haycock, and he was a carriage maker. He had been through quite an apprenticeship back in Pennsylvania in making carriages, and he was a highly skilled workman. Now we have quite a bit of furniture that he built. The thing which has always carried the most sentimental value to me is the cradle which he built in the fall of 1838, just before my grandmother was born. She was his first child, and he built this cradle of cherry wood. And it really is, I think, a beautiful piece of furniture. But it has been used by 5 generations now. My grandmother was rocked in it, my mother was rocked in it, I and my brothers were rocked in it, and both of my daughters, and now all 6 of my grandchildren. I'm afraid that by now it's more of a symbolic thing than being useful, because the cradle isn't much of a way to handle it. But it's a beautiful thing, and I think one day I'll have it refinished and bring out the real beauty of that cherry, because it is something. I don't know, I've heard the story. I can't believe it quite. But grandmother told the story, and it may be that she remembered it wrong. But according to the story I was told, when she was 6 years old, she had 2 younger sisters, and her family went down to Richmond to a yearly meeting of the Quaker church, and were gone for 3 days and left her in charge of the 2 younger sisters. Now, I can't help but believe that 6 was a mistake, that she, because she just couldn't have been that young, but she was very young at any rate. It must have been a difficult time for them. They were pioneers, and I know later grandmother, I heard her talk about snakes being in their cabin and all kinds of things of that kind. Well, that's about all I know about my great-grandfather. Grandmother married George Mason. He was a widower and had 3 children. And then they had twins, my mother and her brother Charlie. And Charlie was killed when he was 14 years old. He was out in the field when a storm came up, and he was struck by lightning and killed. They also, my grandmother raised her husband's grandson. My grandfather had 3 children. Howard was the oldest, and then Grace and Elizabeth. I knew both Aunt Grace and Aunt Lizzie very well. I never knew Howard. But Howard had a son by his first wife, and I think she died in childbirth. At any rate, the son came and grandmother raised him. His name was Emerson, and he was probably the most unfortunate thing that ever happened to my older brother and me. Because later, when grandmother was living with us, as she did all of our lives until 1936, it seems that Emerson was the kind of boy who always did those good things that we forgot to do, and never did those bad things which we did do. And we heard about Emerson day and night, day in and day out, until we called him the Angel Emerson, and we hated him with a passion. Now later, I found out that Emerson, when he was about 20 years old, got in serious trouble with the law, and to avoid going to prison, he joined the Army, and he went to camp down in the South somewhere, and he caught some kind of disease and died a most ignominious death. It would have been an awful thing to us if he had died a hero's death. But my older brother's middle name is Emerson, and he will never admit it. But anyway, the Mason side of the house, I never knew any of the older ones. I knew some of the, I knew grandfather's brother. I knew two of his brothers. And I knew some of his nieces, or no, his nephew and his great-nieces. Frankly, the Masons, I was always told there were a number of rather illustrious people who were closely connected with the family. For example, the Mason-Dixon line was a cousin of one of my ancestors, and General Winfield Scott was a collateral relative of some kind. I never knew them, but my impression of the Masons that I knew was that they were all very brilliant people, but quite peculiar. They were geniuses, but they did awfully funny things. One of them, a much more recent one, about my age, he was a brilliant boy, but he never could get a job except by competitive examination. Nobody would hire him. He had that kind of a personality. But whenever he took a competitive examination, he won it and he got a job. And unfortunately, he had never got to go to college, but he knew a great deal of engineering. And he, totally uneducated, was always criticizing the engineers. And what was even worse than that, almost invariably, he was right. But many of the Masons were like that. Uncle Sam had the farm next to my grandfather's farm there at Maple Grove. He lived in a quite a large log house out there. It's gone now. I've not been out past there more than a couple of times in the last 30 years, but I noticed that the log cabin's gone. My grandfather's house is still there and in quite good shape. Well, anyway, the folks got married. They moved into Andrews to live. My grandfather had been killed by that time in an accident. He was older. He was 68 when he was killed. But so shortly after the folks moved into town, grandmother moved in next door to them. And she lived there about a year, and then she moved in with them, and she stayed there the rest of her life, and it wasn't always as pleasant as it might have been. She was an interesting character. Anyways, one of the most remarkable women I ever knew. But she was strong-willed. It may give you some idea. After the folks had been married a few months while she was living next door, she had been talking to them about a partition. Never knew whether she thought they should put in a partition or whether they should take out a partition. But anyway, she thought they should change their house, and they told her they didn't want it changed. They liked it the way it was. Well, Dad had to go up to Hamilton, Ontario for about 2 weeks. And so he took Mother along, and when they got back, the partition had been changed, and the carpenter sent Dad the bill. I might say right there that all of my life, George and I both always knew that if grandmother told us one thing and the folks told us something else, we should do what grandmother said or we were in trouble. So that wasn't as pleasant as it might have been. It was, I'm sure, quite unpleasant for Dad. I might mention back at the time I was born, a little incident about running. Dad had a hardware store in Andrews at that time, one of his attempts to get away from selling. And one night he went down there and he heard a peculiar noise at the back, so he went back to the side of the building. It was a long store building there. And he just got to the back in time to see a young burglar climb out the back window. And he yelled at him to stop, and the boy took off. Now, he made a mistake. If he'd gone down the alley, he had enough lead that I think likely he could have gotten away, because 100 yards and Dad was done. Instead of that, he climbed a fence and ran across a field. Well, Dad, the way he ran, he'd take hold of the end of the crutch. He'd hop forward, and he could hop a tremendous distance. He could hop better than 10 feet standing, which would be close to a record. But he would hop, and then he would hop and vault. And then he'd hop again while he brought the crutch forward and vault again, and he could go very fast. And, of course, the fence, he didn't even lose stride going over a fence. And he caught the boy at the second fence. And I always thought he was, the burglar must have been somewhat embarrassed by that. Well, when I was about a year and a half old, I think, Dad bought a farm. He seemed to rotate between farms and hardware stores. He bought a farm up in Pulaski County, south of Monterey. My earliest memories are up there. Of course, a child, the things he remembers are always the things that nobody else would ever think of. I remember the three-legged stool that Dad used to milk with. I remember the geese coming up to there was a bunch of lilies planted beside the house, and I remember playing out there and the geese coming up, and I think they pecked at me a few times. And I remember the mailman coming with his horse and buggy and stopping down below. But and I remember going to Sunday school, and our old horse, who made a steady 15 minutes to the mile as we rode in 3 miles to church on Sunday. And the teacher of the nursery class in there, Miss Mary, and I think her name was Mary Miller. But I thought she was wonderful at the time, and undoubtedly she was. But then the summer I was 3, we went for some reason to Oklahoma City. Now, I have several memories of that. I can remember they had wooden sidewalks. They put up they had 2x4s as a base, and then nailed boards on that for a sidewalk. I can remember walking on those. I can remember seeing oil wells. That was my first experience with oil wells. Now, there were oil wells a lot of places, as I remember, and I'm sure there were, in Oklahoma City. I remember one day I got lost. I wanted to go to the store. I got lost, and I inquired for the store, and the direction sent me to a different store, and ultimately I was found and got back. And I remember coming home on a Pullman, and I can remember grandmother and I, and the curtains in front of our section of the Pullman, but that's about it. Well, about in the summer of 1913, I don't know whether it was before or after my 4th birthday, we moved to Wabash. The reason we came here, Dad was on the road again. The farm had not paid off at all, and it didn't matter where he lived. Grandmother was then, she would have been in 13 and 51. No, 1361. She was 74 years old, and she had quite severe rheumatism. And she had a niece here. That would be Oscar Hummer's mother, was grandmother's niece. And they were quite enamored of Dr. Walrod, who was an osteopath here. Now, he was the father of Worth Walrod at North Manchester, and of Verling Walrod at Peru, and Marvel Walrod, Mr. Honeywell's secretary. And he was a very fine osteopath. There was no question about it. He was good. And she came down here and had some treatments, and she thought it helped her. And so the upshot was that we moved to Wabash in 1913. That was after the flood, although I don't know how much of the flood. I remember there was a house down Ward be south, I think, a little way from where Ford's garage, where the Jack Cross garage is. There was a house there with the whole west side out, and it had a bed up on the second floor. It had been left there, and I got the idea that that came from the flood, but I'm quite sure I was mistaken about that. A flood wouldn't do that to a house, but I do remember that.
John, let me
Yeah.
hold on. This is the end of part one.
We moved to what was then known as Monkey Town. I'm completely amazed at how few people today know anything about Monkey Town. But Monkey Town was the area just outside of Wabash on Pike Street, where the Yankee Road meets Pike Street and where Pike Street turns into the Mill Creek Pike. And the story we were told, I know nothing about it, but we were told that some years before there had been a circus here and the monkeys got loose and they were all captured over around Monkey Town, and that's the way it got its name. I don't know why Choketown is much better known. Do you know Choketown? Everybody knows Choketown, but few remember Monkey Town. Well, we moved in on the north side of the street there in a very poor old house. It wasn't much good. And we didn't intend to stay there any longer than we had to, but we had to get a place to live. One of the first things that impressed itself on me here was the streetcar. The streetcar at that time went past our house, on down around the curve onto the Mill Creek Pike, and down. The car stopped at what was then the old Linlawn School. It's gone now, but it was about 150 yards past the Yankee Road on the north side of the road. You can still see the foundations are there. Now, before that, that was the route of the trolley to Peru, because you could still see the ties going on out the Mill Creek Pike, and they went on to Peru. I don't know whether it was that way that people went to Boyd Park or not, but I always heard about people going to Boyd Park, but I wasn't here early enough to do that. And I don't know whether they went on the south side or whether that was after it came over to the north side. By the time we came, the trolley went to Peru by going straight west on Market Street and down that way, and then it wasn't until in the 30s, around 35 or 36, they changed it down to where the old streetcar line went across Wabash Street in Miami and on down past the KFC Hall and that. One of my early memories, now I shouldn't leave out Uncle Joe. He came at Christmas time that year when we lived there on the north side of the street. Uncle Joe was my grandfather Mason's brother. And at 4 years old, of course, I had found out about Santa Claus, and Christmas was coming. It was almost there, and of course, we all looked forward greatly to Santa Claus. And one day I looked out, and the streetcar stopped directly in front of our house. And who got off of the streetcar? But I was sure it was Santa Claus. He had a big white beard, and he had two enormous suitcases. But it turned out it was Uncle Joe. Now, Uncle Joe was a character. He had traveled everywhere. He never considered himself a tramp because he felt his conversation was well paid for his board and room. And he would come and stay with relatives and friends for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time, and he would regale them with stories of where he'd been. Now, he had a wife and family, and he evidently got home sometimes because he had 12 children. But I think he only got home once a year. But anyway, I remembered Uncle Joe, and I don't know that I was particularly disappointed when he turned out not to be Santa Claus because he had such delightful stories to tell. But I remember that streetcar. It was not too long after that. Now, Everett Printy lived across the street from us, and about 6 months later, Everett moved out to a farm near the Asbury Church, and we bought his home, which is a very nice home. It's perhaps 100 yards east of the Yankee Road, and the house is burned now. But it was the first house. There was the old concrete block house there at the corner of the Yankee Road. Earl Unger and his wife lived there, and his father. And we bought the house next to that. Now, one thing there, Earl Unger's father, do you know Earl? Earl's past 90 years old, very tall, slender gentleman, very fine old man. But his father had a grocery store in a little building south of the concrete block house. And I remember that store quite well. I wish I could remember more things about it, because the store at that time was quite a bit different. I remember the cracker dispenser. It was glass, about 2 feet, 2.5 feet wide, and perhaps 3 feet high, and it had a slanting shelf in it of glass, which came almost to the back, but the crackers dropped down behind it so that you could scoop them out. And I remember him scooping out the crackers, and I remember getting coal oil, which was highly important to us, because we couldn't get electric lights at that time outside the city limits. And so we had to get coal oil, and we used it for many other things, I think, besides electric lights. And we got potatoes. I suppose we had canned goods and things, and it was quite an old store. But then we hadn't been there too long, and I don't know what other kids it was, but there were some other kids involved in it, and we thought it was an enormous lot of fun to run across in front of the streetcars that came down. We'd wait till it got almost on it, then we'd run across in front of it. And we thought that was a lot of fun, and that lasted till the second time we did it. Now, Arthur Finkenbeiner, who ran that streetcar, the second time we did it, he stopped the car, and he left, if there was anybody on the car, he left them for a little bit, and he went back of my house, and my dad was back behind the house, and he told him about it. So we didn't do that anymore. We were informed about it. But, of course, that was gravel road down there at that time. I'm not sure even whether there was pavement in town that early. But fairly early, they did pave the street in town, and it went out to the city limits. And then we were about perhaps 300 yards past the city limits at that time. But now, we had not been there very long, a couple of years perhaps, and Dad was extremely interested in getting electricity. And in order to get electricity out of town, you had to get somebody to pay for putting up the line. The users had to build the line themselves. And Dad got some other people to do it, and they built the line out of town so that we got electricity. I've often thought that the private power companies have never regretted but once that they didn't put electricity out in the country, because the REMCs came and the farms have used so much more electricity than city people. But he had to put it out, and after he got the electricity, then we put in a water system. We had a well there, and we put in a pump to pump the water up, and we put in the water system and the indoor toilet and all of that, and we had quite a modern home out there. I don't remember. Let's see, it was 1914 we got our first automobile. Now, we had a horse and buggy before, and we kept the horse and buggy for a while after that. But it was a 1914 Ford, and I can remember a number of things. I remember driving it up to Maple Grove, and a mile south of Maple Grove was a very high hill called the Copeland Hill. And we were always very much interested in whether that car could go up the Copeland Hill and high. And you look at it today, and it was quite a feat to get a Model T up that hill and high. Then I remember coming home from Andrews. We came around through Dory quite frequently. And I remember one night I must have gone to sleep as we were going through the covered bridge at Dory, because when I got home, I thought we were still in that covered bridge when I woke up and we were in the barn at home. Those funny things you remember. Now, it was about 1917 that Dad went into the hardware business again. He and Everett Prentice bought the hardware store at Lake Grove. And I remember their grand opening up there, and they had hot dogs. They had copper boilers. I don't know whether there were, how many there were. There may have only been one, but I think there were more. And they had water boiling in them and hot dogs in them, and everybody had a hot dog, and it was a great day. And I don't know, I think they were doing all right in that hardware store. Dad would take the trolley to come to Wabash, and the trolley came into Wabash Street down at Water Street and turned north to Market Street, and then turned west to the station was down just across the alley west of the Indiana Hotel. You remember probably Hetmansberger's, that was in the old station. But anyway, Dad would get off the streetcar, would slow down to make, or off the trolley, would slow down to make the curve up from Water Street onto Wabash, and then he could go to Bradley's corner, the corner of Canal Street, and catch the streetcar to the south side. And I will never forget one night, I was at home when Dad came home. He had fallen, not once but many times. His clothes were mud from head to foot, and I can't forget his face. It was the most gray. And what had happened? The trolley had started up when he was getting off of it, and it threw him, and he had crushed the stump of his leg, and he was sick for a long time with that before he got over it. And there was never any question of his wearing an artificial leg after that, because that crushed stump was bad, an awful thing. But I take it it took a great deal of his money. He sold the hardware store at Lake Grove, and then he went to work for King Hipskin's hardware store there on Canal Street, and worked there for about a year. And I remember Ernie Shearer was the bookkeeper there, and Allie King was still in the business. I'm not sure whether, what was Hipskin's name?
Is that Homer?
Homer Hipskin. I'm not sure whether he was back yet or not, but Dad worked there for perhaps a year, I don't know, but it was a tough time for the family. I remember, well, I might as well go back and talk about before I went to school. Dad had an idea that a boy shouldn't start school until he was 7 years old. He felt that you got along better if you were more mature. And so George didn't start till he was 7, and they were holding me out till I was 7. And George got to bragging down at school about his little brother and all the things he could do. Now, it would be easy to say that because Dad was away from home so much that we were deprived in some way, but actually I think it was better for us, because Dad would be gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, but then when he got home, he'd be home for a week or 2 at a time, be there all the time, and he spent that time with us boys, and he taught us things. And he was a teacher. I remember one day when I was about, I must have been 5, I don't know. We got out of the car at home, and my mother said, asked Father, what time is it? And he pulled out his big old watch and looked at it and told her the time, put it back, and I remember quite well. I said, I wish I could tell time. I said, you want to learn to tell time? And I said, yes. Well, he said, first we have to learn to count by 5s. And we started it. I very shortly learned to tell time. Well, before I was 7, I could read. I would read the newspaper, and I don't mean that I read every word and understood it, but I'd said most of it. quite well, and I knew a great deal about my numbers and things of that kind. The upshot was that the school principal talked to the folks and suggested why shouldn't they send me down to school? At least I'd learn how to behave myself and be that much further ahead. And so they did, and I went 5 weeks that year, and they decided I knew enough to go into the second grade, so I went into the second grade. But now I remember too, as far as Dad teaching me, and it was years before they taught us how to extract square root in school. That I can remember Dad teaching me how to do squares, and this took care of the 3/4 of it, and then we had this part that we had to figure out yet, and I can't extract square root today. I've forgotten how, but I remember he taught me long before I went. But now I remember in 1918 the snowstorms of that winter. That was one of the great snows that we had. I can remember it was about 250 yards down to the school, and I would have been 9 years old at the time, and I had an awful time getting through the snow to get there. It was up. Most of it was up to my waist. It was hard going.
Yeah.
But I remember the school hacks, the horse-drawn school hacks. I don't remember how many kids they did hold. I would suppose 12 or 15 kids, and they had 2 horses pulling them. And now I remember particularly we were up through on the Walnut Tree Pike. That's now 15, up at the top of the cut. And I remember up there they had cut through drifts that were higher than the school hacks. They must have been at least 8 or 10 feet deep there. It was quite a snow. And of course I remember too the very terrible epidemic we had of influenza that year, which was a terrible thing for all of us.
Did that touch the family at all, John?
I don't remember. None of us had it bad, at least. Now, Bob was born in 1918, and he had a tough time. He had whooping cough before he was 3 weeks old, and generally it's fatal if you get it when you're under 6 months. And I can remember the poor little fellow just whooping himself blind with it. And then he wasn't very old when he had, maybe a year old, when he had scarlet fever. And I remember we had to leave the house. It was quarantine, and we went down and lived with George Roser's folks down on the south side, so we could go to school and that sort of thing. But no, we didn't. I don't think any of us had influenza, but but it was so widespread that everybody knew how awful it was. It was not something that if you didn't have it, you didn't think there was anything to it. It was serious. But we got a new car in 1918. We got a new Ford, which was not nearly as good as the 14 because it was made during the war. And it was pretty cheap in a lot of ways, but it still did the work. And then I remember in 1920 we got ourselves a Dodge. We were big shots then. We really had it. But one interesting thing about cars, there was no rule about driver's license or anything of that kind. And first time I drove a car, I drove that 1914 Ford when I was 8 years old. I sat on Dad's lap to drive it, but I was driving it, and I started driving regularly when I was 12, and Dad was awfully good about letting us drive. I mean, we did the driving and learned. By the way, in 1920, Dad again trying to get away from selling. He and a lot of people from around here went to Texas, the lower Rio Grande Valley. The W.E. Stewart Land Company was developing that land at the time, and they paid all the expenses for you to go down, and you'd have a week's vacation down there free of charge while they sold you land. And the farmers around here went crazy about that. It was fine land. It was some of the most fertile land in the world. And all they needed was water to make it produce, and it would produce 3 crops a year. And these farmers here, they just thought that was wonderful. They went down. Now the price of land here, the very finest land, was sold for $100. $100 an acre here. They paid $300 there and $25 an acre to clear it, to clear off the mesquite. So it's $325 an acre, and all of them bought. And the thing they didn't realize was that everything had to be built from scratch. First, they didn't realize the cost of water. They were used to getting water free, and they didn't realize that the water rent would be very, very high. And second, they didn't realize that the taxes, I mean, when you go out to build all new roads, all new schools, all new facilities, the taxes simply eat you up. And at the end of the first year, almost all of them just abandon it, let it go back for water rent and taxes. Dad fully planned to go down there, but grandmother, who was, she had been, what would she have been, 1920, 20 and 50, 20 and 51, 61, 81. And grandmother put her foot down on it. She had pioneered one new country, and she wasn't about to go to another. Well, we had sold the house we had, the good house, and we bought a house just the second door east of River Street on the north side of the street, and we went up there, and it was...
This was back in Andrews?
No, this is Wabash.
Yeah.
There, River Street, you know, it runs off Pike Street down to the river. Mm-hmm. The second door east of that. I remember when we moved in there, it had no lights. I went to bed by candlelight. And we had put a furnace in the other house. We had a stove there. And did you ever get up on a cold morning when the stove had gone out, the soft coal stove, and you have to build the fire, and you dance around trying to keep warm until the fire, not only till you get it lit, but till it warms up. And we had the outdoor toilet and the whole shebang. It wasn't the nicest place we ever lived, although we got along with it all right. I remember we had quite a berry patch there. We had a strawberry patch. It must have been 200 feet long and 10 feet wide. And I eat berries 3 times a day during strawberry season. We had raspberries, red raspberries, and black raspberries, and all kinds of things. Oh, I forgot something very important to me. When I was 8 years old, I don't know whether we had said something about wanting to buy a horse or whether it was all in Dad's mind, but he came home one day and suggested he knew where there was a horse for sale. Mary Mason. Now, she later married Wilbur Thomas. She and her mother lived on the corner of Orchard and Pike Street over there, and he said that he understood they had a horse for sale. It was a good horse, and maybe George and I would like to go down and look him over and decide whether we'd like to buy him. So we went down and very judiciously looked at old Ned. And he was a wonderful horse. There was no question about it. We thought he was the most marvelous horse we'd ever seen. And they asked us what we thought about it. And we said, well, we'd have to go home and talk to Father first. So we went home, and many years later we found he'd bought the horse that afternoon. But we paid $125 for the horse. And we took him home, and I don't know. I was the one who used him. We never had a saddle. I rode him bareback. And for 6 years I rode that horse. Now, I was lazy. I didn't want to pump water for him to water him, and there was a water tank down at the south side just a mile away, so I rode him down there always to water him. And if you're riding bareback, you don't go to trot. You either go at a gallop or you go at a walk. Well, no kid my age is going to walk all the way to the south side. We went full tilt. Everybody over there said I was going to get killed sometime riding that horse. One of the men who criticized the folks the most, I don't remember his name. He was the old man who swept the street. They had street sweepers. And he was always complaining that something was going to happen to me. Well, I wasn't on the horse. George had him, and George was riding him, and he cast a shoe. And the old man was about, 200 feet away, and that shoe flew down there and bounced around and hit him on the hand, cut his hand badly. Dad paid for that, but I never had any trouble. He did fall with me once. It was wet, and the dog ran out and barked. He jumped sideways. And I thought I was killed, but the horse hurt much worse than I was. But now I can remember when Bob was little, when he was in diapers. See, he's 9 years younger than I. When Bob was in diapers, I'd get him in my arms, and here we go, hell for leather down the south side. Everybody said we're going to get killed. That reminded me of another bit. When we still lived down in the big house, which has since burned, one Christmas, the folks got me a pair of ice skates, the kind that you screwed onto the sole of the shoe. And it happened that fall, there'd been a lot of rain, and there was a big pond out in the field right by the house, a beautiful place to skate. The only trouble was I couldn't stand up. And I had to figure some way. Now that must have been in the winter of 19, because Bob was in diapers. I had to figure some way that I could have something to hold on to stand up. And I figured it out. I fastened a box to a sled and put 2 handles on it. Then I got Bob and wrapped him all up and put him in the sled, and I went out and I could just skate. I hold on to those handles, they held me up, and I just skated all over the place. And everybody in the whole neighborhood said, "Look at John Beauchamp, how good he is to his little brother." Then I realized that I couldn't do any good without him. But the horse was, we rode him down to, either rode him or drove him. We had a buggy. We'd ride or drive him down to Mill Creek, and I learned to swim in Mill Creek. There was a place back near where the stone quarry is now, where the creek kind of went around a little curve, and there it boiled down, and it deepened it out till it was up above our waists. And that's where I learned to swim. First time I swam anywhere else, I swam across Lucan's Lake. But we used to drive the horse down or drive the buggy, ride him down or drive the buggy down, or sometimes I'd let one of the boys ride or go in the buggy, and I'd ride a bicycle, get down there to swim. I remember taking cherries down. There's a big house just this side of the Country Village restaurant. They had quite a cherry orchard there, and we used to pick in the morning and then go swimming in the afternoon. And that was one thing, we worked. We had 4 acres there with a big house, and we put 2 of them out in truck, and Grandmother supervised. She'd raised truck all her life, and her idea was if everybody else hoed corn once every 2 or 3 weeks, you hoe it every week. And we hoed corn till it ran out of years, and every year the chintz bugs came and got it. And if the corn got over 2 feet high, or we had a nubbin longer than your thumb, why, we were lucky. But then we had about a half an acre and other stuff, and we always made money on it. But we had a half acre right by the house. It was the hardest yellow clay you have ever seen. It wouldn't grow anything that anybody wanted grown. But it had huge quantities of mustard that just grew up wild out there, and we'd cut that mustard and wrap it up in packages about 15 inches long and 8-10 inches around, paper and newspaper. And we'd sell it along with tomatoes. I remember we sold and beans and things like that. We'd go out mostly down West Main and West Hill, and we went house to house selling and that mustard, we made more money off that than the whole rest of the deal. It was quite something. But one thing that is interesting, how you remember the people who were nice to you and the people who weren't nice to you in a deal like that, where you're going house to house. Now, one family that I remember with the particularly kind feeling was the Warren Biglers. That was Mary Adams' father and mother. They were always so very nice to me when I went to their house to sell. And I remember another home where they let me know very early in the game I was to go to the back door.
John Beauchamp, Part 3.
We planted this truck after we moved from the big house to the one further east. We didn't have the room, so we rented some ground and we put that out in the truck and sold it. But after 6 years of raising truck, I said that I was never going to plant anything else as long as I lived unless I was awfully hungry. And I've never gotten that hungry yet. We have some garden that we would like to give somebody. We have space for garden we'd like to give somebody now, but I'm not about to plant it. But now working was one thing that they didn't have child labor laws then, and we worked at a lot of different things. For a while, when I was quite small, 11, 12 years old, I was cutting grass, mowing lawns. I remember two particularly that I mowed for a couple of years. We're up at the corner of, we're up on East Street, right by Hill Street. The corner on the house on the northeast corner of Hill and East belonged to Jim Almond, who was the editor of the newspaper. And I don't remember him. He later went to Chicago and made a big success, and I think it was with the Tribune, I'm not sure. He had a very lovely wife, and she was the one that I knew. And then the Mr. and Mrs. Tower lived next door to that. I used to cut their lawn. Then in the summer, when I was 12 years old, I started working at the canning factory. That was on the south side of the river, right at the back of Deals. I think Deals, the back end of Deals, is where the canning factory was, or part of it. But at 12, I started catching the hot cans. That I think they paid us 25 cents an hour, which wasn't bad. We put gloves on. We'd pick up 3 cans in each hand and put them over into the big iron basket to go into the cooler. And I did that a couple of years. I worked there for several years. Now, the last time I worked there, I remember I was rather proud of the fact that I earned a promotion there. They put me up. It was a good job. I was putting the cans on the track. 2 of us had what we called rakes, about, I suppose 5 feet long, and they had little pieces sticking out. You could put them down onto the cans, into the empty can, and then you flipped them, carried them over and flipped them onto the moving track. And 2 fellows, without working too hard, could keep that track full, and it needed to be full because you didn't want any stoppage in the track. Well, I'd done that for several days. Pearl Sharp, I'd gone to school with him. He was the one helping me. And one morning I got there and Pearl didn't come. And I didn't know. I was way up in the attic of the place. And the track started. I knew the cans needed to go on, and I figured he would be there shortly, so I started putting them on. And he didn't come. And for one guy to keep that track full, you had to run. And I kept it full till about 10:30 that morning, and then there began to be empty spots and show up. And it wasn't long after that till the big shot, I forget what they called him, he and Dr. Bob LaSalle was in college at that time, and he worked there in the summer vacation, and he was a supervisor. And they came up to see what had happened and wanted to know where my helper was, and I told them he hadn't shown, and they were amazed that I had kept that busy all morning, but they told me to do the best I could, and they'd get somebody to help me quickly, and sure enough they did. About 10 minutes, and about a half an hour later they brought another one up and taught him to do my job and took me down and gave me the best job in the whole factory. I got 35 cents an hour instead of 30. But also, I took those baskets after the hot cans were put in the basket. Then they were lowered down into a water, and they went through a track for about 3 hours to cool them, and then you had to have somebody take them out. It required some skill and a great deal of care to get them out. If you dropped one, it allowed to break the whole track and the whole place would be down. But they put me on that. Well, then you see, I would come at 7 o'clock, but I'd have nothing to do until 10.
Till I got to yours.
And then at noon, I would have to be there to take them out, but then at 3 o'clock, I'd have an hour off. And then everybody else went home, and I would work 3 hours longer. So I was getting 3 hours I got 4 hours extra pay a day, besides getting more per hour. So I had it made there. I was in good shape. But we were expected to work. Later I carried papers. I carried the papers down. The first route I had was West Market and Canal. Oh, that was a rough deal. Very poor people on the route, and some of them not too nice. I still remember one guy. I thought surely when I was prosecutor I'd get him up someday, and I was going to try and stick it to him for all I had. He's the one who got into me for 5 weeks. He kept promising to pay, and I remember so well, one Saturday I stopped and tried to collect, and he was very contrite about the whole thing. He said, "This is going on entirely too long. Now you stop Monday night, and I'll have the money here, and I'll pay you Monday night, sure." And he moved out on Sunday. He moved up to Urbana. But he went out of the county. I had hopes I would get him, but I didn't.
John, going back to the canning factory for a second, do you know who owned the canning factory and the supervisors, and what did they can and under what labels? Do you remember any of that?
No, I don't remember. Now, I remember when a man named Camel was the supervisor of it. Another man, now, what was his name? Lived up here on Hill Street. They moved away, and then his wife moved back here, lived out in Bondbrook a few years ago. But I don't know. But I don't know
what did they can?
They canned corn, peas, and tomatoes. They've got a lot of them.
Did they have a brand, do you remember, a label or anything?
I don't know. Those, as far as working there, you would never see them. Mm-hmm. But because the labels weren't put on until later. But I have no idea what brand it was. Yeah. But for a kid, it wasn't a bad place to work. It was. Oh, I remember one night I worked down there nights one summer. That was later. I was somewhat older. Anyway, it was before 24 was built. But there was a fellow working down there, and he had a watermelon patch. And he didn't think anybody knew where it was. And he bragged down there that nobody was going to get into his watermelon patch and get any watermelons. Well, 5 of us went out. We got an hour off at midnight. And 5 of us got into our old Dodge. And we knew where it was. Somebody did. Because we went out 13 to where 24 goes east now. But at that time, it was just a little Lover's Lane road. Just 2 tracks back in there. But down... there's the old schoolhouse down there by that forest. The forest hadn't been planted then, of course. But we went down there, and back of that schoolhouse down in there was the watermelon patch. And 5 of us stole 22 stinking melons. Now, we got good ripe ones. We went out at the east end, isn't it? Grand Street ran past the General Tire's office. Well, at the east end of that, at that time it was the service motor truck. And we broke those melons on the curb, and all we could do was eat the hearts of them. There was too much for 5 guys. Couldn't eat those melons, my goodness. But we'd eat the hearts out, and then we'd take it and we would throw it. And there's something about a splattering watermelon on pavement that is always interesting. Next day, there was what they called the Malamoon Cafeteria. It was run by the service motor truck for employees and others. And Kiwanis met out there every Tuesday. I used to drive Doc Smith. I'll tell about that a little later. But anyway, I worked in the kitchen, and Kit Moore was the cook, he and his wife. And he was telling me about some terrible boys who had made an awful mess down at the east end of Grand Street the night before, because I didn't know anything about it at the time. But, by the way, that route down West Market and Canal, I had a customer or two down past B. Walter and Company, way down there. And when I got down there, I was only 3/4 of a mile from home if I could wade across the river. If I had to come back around by the bridges, it was 3 miles. Uh-huh. And so early in the spring and late in the fall, we were wading the river, even though would get pretty cold. And it was pretty filthy, too, with the sewer right down just above there, less than a mile. But then when it got bad weather and you couldn't wade the river, I suddenly realized that the streetcar, when it crossed the river bridge here, it made a square turn to go down Columbus Street, and it slowed down real good. And the streetcars had the cowcatchers on the back and front, and they'd pull the one on the back up. So I went out and caught onto that cowcatcher, and I rode out till I got to Quaker Avenue, about 150 yards before the end of the line. And I got off and went sauntering on down home. And I think it was the 3rd day that I did that, that Russ Cuffle, who was running the streetcar, was waiting in the door. And as I came past, he said, "John, why don't you ride the rest of the way?" Well, Russell and I got together on the deal, and I got a paper, an extra paper every night, and I'd give him a paper, and then he'd let me ride. And he and I got acquainted. I used to, in the evening when I had nothing to do, I'd go on and ride with Russell, and he was a gregarious sort. He liked to have company, and it was nice for both of us. That's Don Couple's father. Mrs. Max Baker's father. And, he was quite a boy. Well, then we came when we finished the 8th grade. Now in school, I took the 5th and 6th in 1 year. I got within a year of my brother George that way. And he was out at the high school. And although he took high school then in 3 years, so he got back 2 years ahead of me again. But we went to high school from out there for at least a year or so. And usually I walked. Occasionally I'd ride the streetcar. And a lot of the students did ride the streetcar. It cost a nickel. But I remember Francis Mills, Doc Mills. He lived down there at the corner of Meadow Street and Pike. And he caught on to the cowcatcher one time. And, that car was full of high school kids. And along Columbus Street, Finkenbeiner knew that Doc was back there. And slowed the car up, so it wasn't going very fast, and he picked up the switching iron, and he went back and opened that window and cracked back across the knuckles, and he spread eagled all across that track and tore his knickers all badly, and I always thought that was a little severe. Oh, another thing that happened along about that time, we had an independent football team here. The old WAA had its days of glory were gone, but they still had a very good team. But they had a policy that any boys under 14 years old got in free. And the only trouble with that was they decided whether you were 14 or not by whether you wore long trousers. Well, lots of the boys, 18 and 19, were putting on knickers and going down there and getting in free. But I grew very early. I was, between my 11th and 12th birthdays, I grew a foot. I was 5 feet 9 when I was 12. And I couldn't get knickers. All I could get was long trousers. I go down there, 12 years old. I go down and tell them, look, I'm only 12. You got long trousers. You're over 14. And the result of that was most ignominious. I had to go down to the other end of the field. They had a grandstand down there that had been made for baseball. And underneath the grandstand there was a hole where I had to crawl in. And I always thought that was an ignominious thing for a nice boy like me to have to crawl in to get into the football game. But we saw it. Well, I remember coming over here to school. The first day was quite a thing. The old high school, the administration building now, was terribly overcrowded. And they had to divide up the assembly room, was divided into 4 classrooms. And they held the convocations down at the theater. So the first day we had a convocation down at the theater, and all of us went down there. And then they got all the freshmen together, and they had to run the gauntlet up that hill to the Presbyterian church, and every upperclassman was there with a paddle to help you along. And I ran the gauntlet. Unfortunately, the next year was the year they decided to cut that out, so I didn't get to paddle anybody. But now we had the school was we had some interesting teachers, some very fine teachers too. O.J. Neighbors was superintendent. Of course, he was superintendent for, I expect, 30 years. Very great man. And Darnell was the principal. One thing I always liked that Darnell did that I always liked, there was a time there when the boys with money got to dressing up a great deal. And it made it tough on the boys that didn't have much. And Darnell quietly went around to a number of the leaders, and they started a fad of wearing overall trousers. And everybody could afford them. I thought that was a real good idea. So we had Darnell and, let's see, Ruth Jones taught English. She was a heavy-set lady, one of the nicest ladies I ever knew, and did a good job in English. Cornelia Blaney taught Latin, and, she was a teacher from the word go. And Bess Bear taught mathematics. And did you ever know Bess Bear?
No, I met her before she left to go to Warren, I think. Where she
Well,
finished
before
her
she left, she was pretty senile.
Yeah.
And she used to stop me on the street, and she always asked the same question. John, I wasn't too easy, was I? And I could look her in the eye and say, no, Miss Bear, you were not too easy. I always remember she prided herself on being able to talk extremely fast. And the first day of each year, she started off exactly the same way. I can't say it as fast as she did, but she would start out, mathematics is an exact science. The answer to a question is either right or it is wrong. If it's right, you get full credit. If it is wrong, you get no credit. 75 is a passing grade in this course, and that does not mean 74 and 7/8.
That was it.
That was it. That's the way it was. An odd thing. All the way through high school, I always felt that there was something wrong with the teaching of English literature. In my entire high school, I only heard 2 modern poems. One was The Highwayman, which was read by some woman in a convocation. And the other, why, I don't know, but Bess Bear read us the Congo in a mathematics class. But in English class, we never had anything modern. I got the idea that things like the Spoon River Anthology, there was something wrong with them. Maybe you ought to hide them under a pillow or something. And I got to read them when I was about a senior in high school. But now, one man I don't want to leave out because he was so very important to me, and he was important to every kid in Wabash for 30 years, was W.C. Mills, Cecil Mills. He came back about 1918 or 19, and it wasn't too long after that I don't know, he started the Boy Scouts here and the Cub Scouts, and I was into that program early. He taught a Sunday school class at the Friends Church on the south side. I don't know whether I mentioned that my mother and grandmother were Hicksite Quakers. That is the old line Quaker. My grandmother never said you for one person in her life. It was thee and thy, and not Sunday or Monday either. It was first day and second day. And Mother always used the plain language with a member of the family or another Quaker. Now, how she could keep it straight, I don't know, but she did. She couldn't keep her boy's name straight. She called the roll. She wanted Bob, George John, Bob Elmer. But she kept that straight. I might say on that, I think the Quakers, I don't know whether there was any Quaker philosophy remained with my dad or not. Of course, I got it from mother and grandmother, and actually, in most ways, I think that probably I'm more a Quaker than I am a Methodist. In my basic thinking. Interesting thing along that line, I was, the records of the Methodist Church, the Middle Street over there, will say that I was baptized and joined the church, but I didn't. Now, the folks didn't believe in having us baptized. It was something for us to decide when we wanted to be baptized. Now, they encouraged it, you understand. I think I was about 8 years old when I decided to join the church and be baptized, and we went down to the church, and I got up in front of everybody. There were several of us being baptized in the church. And I apparently was all right. I don't know, but all at once I got sick. I threw up all over everything, and they led me out. When I came back in, they said I'd been baptized with a member of the church. So I got to being with my Quaker background. The Quakers don't believe in water anyway. So, at any rate, that may have been one reason the folks were very much in favor of me going over to the Quaker Sunday School to W.C. Mills' class, and then I'd go over to Middle Street a block away to church with the folks. By the way, we used to walk down to church every Sunday and back a mile. I thought about it lots of times. We got such a thoroughgoing course in private property, all the way down to church and all the way back from church and many other times. Now stay on the sidewalk. Don't get on that lawn. That's that man's lawn. You have no business there. The sidewalk is for you. You stay there. We got that all the time. Of course, today you drive down the street. You don't tell a kid, well, now stay off the man's lawn because he's in the car. But W.C. Mills, he was a Pied Piper with kids. I mean, he could lead kids. He could get them to do anything in the world. And, of course, he always led them in a proper way. He started his program of community service. We still have it. It has never, unfortunately, it doesn't mean as much to kids today as it did then. It was, and I don't think that's, certainly I wouldn't blame Don Bear because I think he does a wonderful job. But we had nothing else to do. And so we were into that, and the old gymnasium over here on Huntington Street, that was used by the high school, but it was also used by the community service. There's a man named Shaver helped Mills with it. Maybe he was I think he was hired partly by probably he was hired by the city, but he helped Mills. Remember, they did have a swimming pool down in there. Did you ever see that? Mm-mm. There was one year that was used that I can remember, but I think it got to leaking and they had to quit using it. I can remember trying to play water polo down there. But then Cecil got the boys to making skis and toboggans. And also we made bows and arrows. All kind. We had rifle shooting and all kinds of things of that kind. But the skis and the toboggans, we made them, and I didn't. I wasn't any good at it, but the boys did. And then in the winter we went down to Paradise Valley down on Mill Creek. There was a lovely hill down there, and I used the toboggans. I tried skiing once and sat down instead of falling sideways, cracked my tailbone. And one time I remember I broke through the ice on the way home, and I rode a toboggan behind the car and froze my feet, which caused me a great deal of trouble. But then Cecil Mills had there was a man out by Rowan named Schuler that had some land. The road went along Eel River there north of Rowan, and the land between the road and Eel River was no good to raise anything. And Schuler owned this land, and Cecil Mills got him to donate the use of it at least for a Boy Scout camp, which we called Camp Schuler, Schuler and Eel River. And we'd go out there, and we had places we swam, and we passed the swimming merit badges, and we had canoes, which they made in community service, and we practiced with it, and we were there for a week or two, played volleyball and all kinds of things, and had campfires at night. And I remember, perhaps that was the first place I ever came in contact with Negroes. There was a Negro lived on West Market Street. They called him Brownie. I don't know how old he was. He had a boy my age, or about my age, little Brownie. And he was the cook. And we thought that his bread pudding was the finest eating we'd ever had. I expected as hungry as we'd get that anything would taste. I don't suppose I'd care for it at all now, but it was wonderful then. And little Brownie was a handsome little Negro boy. I remember he had a purple and white sweater, and did he look like a million. And he was a good little athlete for about 8th grade. He was a pretty good pole vaulter, and I got to know them. And then Bert Ferguson was out there. His father was a barber over here. His father had very white features, but was dark in color. Bert had both white features and was quite light. And I haven't seen Bert for 30 years, but I've been told that he was passing as white somewhere, and I expect he could. But Bert was an awfully nice guy, and he was a very good student. He was a good, strong B student in school, and I liked him. Then. Well, to go on with Cecil Mills, I would say just this, that I think there were a lot of boys that would have spent their lives in prison that turned out to be pretty good citizens on account of say, Cecil Mills. I would say 3 men had more to do with my upbringing, had more influence on me than anybody else. Dad, of course, and Cecil Mills, and then there was Doc Smith. Dr. Smith lived where the Hoover Minor Funeral Home is. They bought it from him about 1928 or 9. He was a medical doctor. In 1918, he was out with his patients during the flu epidemic for 3 days and nights. and he was driving home. He had a Jackson automobile, which had the gas tank right underneath the dash. And he went to sleep, and he turned it over, and the gasoline spilled out on his legs and caught fire, and it burned both legs off. Now, Dr. Smith was the most courageous man I have ever known. I have always thought the world and all of him. But when his legs were burning off, people came, and he had to talk them into coming and pulling him out of there because they were afraid it would explode. But he talked them into pulling him out, and then he got one man to go back and get his medicine case, and he gave himself a hypodermic right out there. It was on what's now 13, right near the Bolivar Bridge. And they brought him into town, and I've heard the story from others of how when they took him to the hospital and called Mrs. Smith, who was a very fine-looking woman, and in many ways a very fine woman. But she went to the hospital, and when she saw him, she became hysterical. They told the story that Doc said, what was her first name? Alice. Alice, I'm ashamed of you. But I got a job driving.
Part 4.
Going back a little bit, I told something about old Mr. Unger's grocery store down there just south of the Mill Creek Pike on the Yankee Road. Some of my memories of that grocery store, and I was very small, but I remember, for example, the cheese, which was in a large disc, and he kept it under glass, a glass cover, and when you ordered cheese, he would take the cover off and he would slice it off like a piece of pie. And I was always amazed at how close he could come to the exact weight that you asked for. Then I remember the old coffee grinder. It was an enormous red machine and had a great big wheel, and you pour the coffee in and put a sack under it, and then he would grind this. He would turn this big wheel, and that would grind the coffee for you. Then I don't think we traded there. I don't think his store lasted very long, and I don't think it was much of a store. But I remember particularly that after that, Frank Gertner started a grocery store down at the south side. That was the intersection of Vernon Street and Columbus. He was on the northwest corner. And I remember quite well that Frank used to go house to house in the morning taking grocery orders. Then he'd go back to the store and package up the orders. Then they were put in a one-horse cart, delivery cart, which was enclosed like a truck. And in the afternoon, his man would deliver the orders which he had taken that morning. But the thing that's so hard for me to understand is what the Sam Hill did my mother order every day, because every day she had a grocery order. Now, in those days, we had no refrigeration, not even ice. The things which needed to be kept cool in order to keep were put in the basement. And we had pans down there with water in them to keep them cool. We put the butter and the milk and things of that kind in these pans full of water to keep cool. But now we, seems to me as I remember back, we had most of our own food. For example, we had chickens, and the chickens laid eggs, so we had chickens and eggs. We'd kill a rooster whenever we wanted a chicken dinner. And we had a cow, and the cow gave the milk, and we kept the cream, and once a week we would churn the butter in a churn there at home. We had, in the summer, Mother spent most of the summer canning vegetables and fruits. We canned green beans, we canned corn, we canned tomatoes, and I think several other things. And then we canned fruits. Chiefly, we canned peaches and cherries. I think we canned I think perhaps we canned berries. We had a lot of berries after we moved up east of River Street. And Mother baked the bread. I can remember so well, she made what she called biscuits from the bread dough, which was left over after making the loaves. She would put them in a pan, and they stood straight up, and there were quite a large number of them, and they were they were good when they were hot. You put lots of butter on them, and they were wonderful. But they were not very good after they got cold. But the loaves of bread were better after they got cold. But it's difficult for me to remember what she could have bought. Now she had to buy sugar, and she had to buy salt and pepper and things of that kind, the seasonings. But I can't remember what. Now we raised hogs. We'd butcher the hogs, and we'd make the bacon, and a ham would be cured and kept for the year. Sausage was canned. I think it was cold packed, they called it. We'd buy a quarter of beef, and Mother would cold pack some of it. Although most of the beef, as I remember, was made into dried beef. They'd have the butcher cut it into proper sizes and shapes. And then Grandmother and Mother prepared a formula. I don't know what all was in it, but there was lots of salt and saltpeter and brown sugar. Those three things I know were in it. And they'd work it so that it was worked into the meat pretty well through it. Then they'd hang the pieces up in our attic, and they would dry for about 6 months, and then they were ready for dried beef. And I always said I was in college before I found out that dried beef gravy wasn't a staple that you had at every meal like bread and butter. My mother was a wonderful cook for a big meal, a company meal. But for every day, she wasn't very good. The chief trouble was she always waited till about 5 minutes before the meal, and then say, "What can I have for dinner?" And usually it was dried beef gravy, and we'd put it on bread. But remarkably, I never got tired of dried beef. I still like it. I don't know how to make it, and I haven't had it for years and years. It's not the same as this chipped beef you got in the cans in the store. It had much more of a beef flavor to it, and I remember, 10, 15 years ago, Ward Vandergrift brought me some. His father-in-law, Ralph Gongmer, made it. And I thought it was wonderful, and I fixed dried beef gravy, and I ate it all myself, but my wife didn't like it, and so that was the end of that. But as I say, I don't know what we bought at the grocery store, but I do know that Mother ordered groceries every day.
John, in living on the south side in this era, did you have central heat, central lights, or anything like that? What was the house itself like?
When we first moved in to the south side, we had neither central heating nor electricity nor water in the house. When we bought the house from Everett Printy, we moved into one house, lived there 6 months, then we moved across the street. And that was a good house. And after we got it, Dad put in central heating. He put in he got some of the neighbors to help pay to put the lighting out there. The power company wouldn't put the lights in outside the city limits unless the subscribers paid for the line, a matter which they have regretted ever since the REMC came in, because it was the most short-sighted thing they ever did. But Dad and the neighbors got the electricity down there, and then after that, he put in a water system so that we did have an indoor toilet. We had a bath, and we were pretty modern there. Then in 1920, I don't remember, did I tell about Dad going to Texas?
Yeah. No, go ahead and repeat it anyhow, because we talked about the Rio Grande, but I can't remember whether it was on tape or not.
Well, he went down to, in 1920, the W.E. Stewart Land Company was selling land in the Rio Grande Valley. And they invited a lot of people to go down and spend a week and have a vacation with all expenses paid. And Dad went, and a lot of farmers around Wabash went. And this land, it was wonderful land. There was no question. It was rich land. And they could raise 3 crops a year. and the farmers from Indiana just went wild with it. Now land here around Wabash, the best land, was selling for around not more than $100 an acre. They paid $300 an acre for that land down there, and then $25 an acre to clear to the mesquite bushes. But what they didn't realize was the cost of water rent, because the cost of the water was very high, and they were used to having rain free of charge. And the second thing they didn't realize, the cost of taxes in a place where you had to build everything from scratch. There were no schools, there were no roads, there was nothing. I remember Dad telling about an intersection, each road was just 2 tracks through the fields. And at the place where 2 of them crossed, there was a big sign which said, "This is the site of the future city of Weslaco." Now, Weslaco was W.E. Stewart Land Company, is made out of that. And Weslaco today is over 20,000 people, and it's right there where that was done. Well, Dad fully planned to move down there. He's still fighting to get off the road, off selling. And he planned to move down there, and he sold her house on the south side. And then my grandmother raised such a fuss. She had pioneered in Indiana, and she didn't intend to pioneer in Texas. And the upshot was that they had to give it up, and he bought the other house. I might say that we didn't move to Texas. He sent 2 men down there, both of whom stayed. They farmed his land the first year, and if they hadn't had, they planted cabbage, and the first crop of cabbage, at the time they were ready to market, the price was $108 a ton, and they had many tons to the acre. And they'd have made a tremendous amount of money, but the day before they were to market, the switchman struck, the railroads closed down, there was no way to get that cabbage out of there, no trucks back in 1921, and by the time they were able to get the cabbage out, most of it had rotted in the field, and what little was left, they got $8 a ton, because instead of I think it was $110 a ton when they would have marketed. They could have paid for the land very easily that one year. But a man named Small Street and a man named Talbert, both from Lake Grove, young men, they farmed it for Dad, and they stayed down there, and they made money down there. But almost everybody from here lost everything they put into it. Dad, being a salesman, went down and sold his and bought some from some of the other farmers, letting it go for nothing, and he'd pay them $75, $100 for land they'd paid many thousands of dollars for, and he managed to sell them. Dad came out, he lost money, but he wasn't so far in the hole on it. But anyway, because of that, because he sold that house, we moved to the house second door east of River Street. And that was, it wasn't a bad house, but it was absolutely unmodern. We had no lamps, and when we moved in there, we had to use candles. I remember going to bed by candlelight, and there was an outdoor toilet, a pump on the back porch, and that's the way it was. I also remember, I never will forget cleaning out the chicken house there. The chicken manure has never smelled very good to me since. But it was there we had the big berry patches and that sort of thing. So there were advantages to it too, and we got lights in, and but we never did get central heating. And I can remember getting up early in the morning when it was colder and blitzing, running down and starting a fire down there, and then waiting till it heated up, and you're dancing first on one foot, then on the other, trying to keep warm. So another thing I remember there, by that time there began to be quite a bit of traffic, and yet the road was gravel road, and the dust was simply awful. Mother would, she'd dust everything in the house the first thing in the morning. By 10 o'clock you could write your name on everything, and it was not, you could barely see your name. It was heavy dust by 10 o'clock, and so it was quite bad that way. I remember about that time, Dad, again getting off the road, went to work for Case's Bakery Case's Bakery was at the corner of Wabash and Hill Street on the northeast corner, backed up to the railroad. And Dad was bookkeeper for Case's Bakery, and I remember Mr. Case bought 2 pigs and turned them over to my brother and me. And we fed the pigs on the stale bread and burned bread from the bakery. And boy, did that fatten up those pigs. And when they got ready, the one pig went to Mr. Case, and we had the other pig to butcher. And I remember I think I was 12 years old at the time. And we had a .22 rifle, and I thought it would be a wonderful thing for me to shoot the pig. And I remember we took the pig out in front of the barn, and I loaded the rifle, and he was standing there quite satisfied with everything, looking at me. After all, I'd been feeding him all the time. And I shot him right between the eyes, and I have never forgotten. One minute he was alive, and the next minute he was dead. And I've never killed anything since, and I don't ever want to kill anything since. It just turned me, well, I say I never killed it. I killed chickens and things of that kind, but no animal. I just don't like to kill animals, don't want any part of it. Well, now I talked about the community service. I remember while I was living out there, the community service put on a circus in the old gym up at between Huntington Street and Wabash Street. You went down Huntington Street 45 steps into the gymnasium floor part, and they put on a circus to raise money for community service. And I remember 3 acts in that circus. One was R.W. Stoops, that's Dr. Gene Stoops' father, who was a young mail carrier at that time, pretty well-built man, and they had him dressed up with some kind of a, I don't know whether it was a sweatshirt or a T-shirt or something like that, and stuffing all around the arms and shoulders, so he looked tremendously strong. And he was the strong man, and he came out and they had weights on a bar, and they were marked, I don't remember, something like 1,000 pounds, I expect. Maybe it was only 600. But anyway, he strained and groaned and raised it up, and then he got it back down again. And then he was bowing as the little boy, about 9 years old, ran out, picked it up, and ran off with it. Of course, that was the old gag. Second thing, a second act which was quite bona fide. Oliver Showalter, who was a photographer here, and he had been quite an athlete in his day for many, many years, up until he was, I suppose Ollie Showalter was perhaps 50 years old then. And he had, for many, many years, he had been the tennis champion of Wabash. He was a great athlete. But he had a trick bicycle, and he put on an exhibition of trick bicycle riding. And we were told, and I believe it was true, that he held the record for balancing a bicycle without movement for the longest anybody had ever done it. It was quite a number of hours. And he put on an act that you would seldom see anything to equal that. Then the third thing I remember was a wrestling match between John Beauchamp and George Beauchamp. My older brother George, he was 2 years and a half older than I was, and looking back, I suspect I exaggerated, but I thought he was giving me a dirty deal all my life. And he was bigger than I was and stronger than I was till about that time. And they put us in to wrestle, and that was the first time I ever beat him. And I beat him wrestling, and from then on, life was sweeter for me. No, I wasn't that good a boy at fighting. Basically, I was opposed to fighting because I was a consummate coward. I remember one fight I did get in up at the gym. I don't know how it happened, but I was from out of town. I was from out in the country, you see, and the country boys and the city boys. The city boys didn't think the country boys amounted to much and let them know it. But George Ross, who was perhaps a year older than I am, was itching for a fight, and there was quite a crowd around, and he drew a line and challenged anybody to step across it, he would whip them. And about that time, somebody gave me a shove, and I came out away second best on that deal. But by the way, speaking of that old gym, I remember a basketball game down there. It was my freshman year in high school, and we played Huntington. Wabash had never been any good in basketball. They'd been very strong in football. The trouble was the boys played football when they should have been playing basketball, I think. But that year we had a pretty fair basketball team. And it was the first time in all history, as I recall, that was the way we were told, it was the first time the Wabash had ever defeated Huntington in a basketball game. And the way it worked was this: Huntington was ahead 22-21 when the gun shot, but just before the gun shot, one of the Huntington men fouled a Wabash man, and it was a two-shot foul. And at that time, one man shot all the free throws for a team, and Fred Morrow was the free throw shooter. By the way, they had picked a man as referee of the game. He was a man high in the YMCA. I think it was a mistake to pick him. He didn't know any basketball. He wasn't much of an official, actually. But anyway, he officiated the game, and he called this foul, and Fred Morrow shot the first free throw, and he made it, which tied the game at 22-22. And one of the Huntington boys grabbed the rebound and threw the ball down so high that it bounced up into the rafters, and the referee put a technical foul on him. Then Fred missed the second free throw, so it left it 22-22, but he got to shoot the technical, and he made that, so we won the game 23-22. The Huntington coach led the attack on the referee, and Grant Stenger was the Wabash coach. He was a very large man. He played both football and basketball at Northwestern and weighed over 200 pounds. And George Arnell, who was quite a football player and later a very important official, they got on each side of the referee, and they got him downstairs and out the back door. But I never will forget those 45 steps going up. Fists were flying all the way. And when I got to the top of those steps and out onto Huntington Street, I saw the streetcar headed south going down the hill. And I ran to beat everything down to the corner at Wabash Street and Market, and caught the streetcar and got on home quick. Might mention that at that time the football games were played in the old Cook Field, which was down on South Carroll Street. At that time the interurban went out West Market Street, and Cookfield came up to where the old interurban tracks go west. It came right up to, I think that's Erickson Street. And it had a wooden wall around it, and it was just dirt. There was no grass. I remember one game we played there in 1925 that we had a real good team that year, but the south side of Fort Wayne tied us in the mud, and the Peru game was set for a certain Saturday, and it had rained, and Cookfield was absolutely covered with water. There were only about 3 small islands of land in the whole field, and Peru refused to postpone the game because they thought perhaps they could beat Wabash in the mud. They went down and played the game there. George Ross almost drowned in the bottom of a pile-up down there. I never will forget. Of course, I didn't play football. I wasn't much of an athlete, but I was down there, and I never had such muddy shoes in my life. And I remember going to, I think it's Jimmy Stefanata's place, just south of where the bank is now, to get my shoes shined. And Leroy Wood, who was a Mr. 5x5, he was an all-state tackle on the football team, and Negro, and he was a very good friend of mine, a wonderful guy. And I never will forget, I apologized to him for bringing such muddy shoes, and I remember he said, "John, you pay your dime, you get them shined." That was it. Well,
let's get back to school, maybe, John.
All right,
We
the
got as
school?
far as, the ninth grade, and you were...
Well, you see, I lived on the south side when I went to the freshman year in high school, ninth grade. Dad paid tuition for me to come in. He had paid tuition for George, too, because he felt that we got more, we had a greater choice of subjects here than we would at Linlow, which had a very small high school and had no choice of subjects whatever. So we came in, and I was here the first year. Then the second year, we moved to town. Dad bought the house at 188 North Wabash Street, which I'll never forget the first time I saw that house. I thought that was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I think it was. It had been built about 1900 by a very wealthy man named Robinson. I think he was a banker. And the story was he built it as a small house. It only had 12 rooms, and he and his sister, he was a bachelor and she was an old maid. They lived there together. But I remember some of the things in there. It had one thing I remember. It had inlaid hardwood, the dark hardwood in patterns around the edge of the floors. Beautiful stuff. You couldn't get it now. You couldn't, and if you could, you couldn't afford to put it in. It had a lot of bric-a-brac over the up above, around the stairway, and over at the entryway as you went in. It had a stained glass window in front. When the house burned last winter, I said if nobody wanted that stained glass window, I would like to take it. I wouldn't want to see anything happen to it, but somebody did want it, I guess, so I didn't get it. But then it had 3 fireplaces. They were all, what's the word I want? Comes in little squares of tile.
Tile.
They're all tile fireplaces, 2 downstairs and 1 upstairs, and it had about 4 rooms downstairs that could all be opened up. George had a dance there one night. I'll never forget it. It was a beautiful place for it. In the dining room, they had a bell that you could push with your foot to notify the maid out in the kitchen to bring things in. There was the opening from the kitchen to the dining room where they could put the food through. And I tell you, for a little country boy, that was quite a something. Oh, wait a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. There are a couple of things I want to tell about that were older. One was Shanty Falls. Did you ever hear Shanty Falls, George? Have you been there?
Yes. Tell me what your impressions are.
When I was a boy, you could get back to Shanty Falls. It was right north of the Friends Cemetery on Mill Creek Pike. There was a house just west of the cemetery, which was way back off the road, and a family named Hutchins lived there, and they were very kind to let us go back there and drive back, and we'd drive back through their barn lot and through a long lane, which took us right back to the falls, and as long as we closed the gates, we were welcome to go. You go back there, and you go down the hill, and then you come back south to the falls. There was a deep ravine. The walls of that, I don't know how high they would have been, but I would suppose they'd be 100 feet high, and they were the limestone, and there were what we called caves, holes into them. Last time I was there, the tops had fallen down, so they weren't there anymore. But the falls, it was not such a high fall, but it cut down to where it got the Blue Point rock, the very hard rock. And I would judge the falls was 12 to 15 feet high. There was not a great deal of water, but some came over. Of course, in the spring there'd be quite a bit. So that down below, the water had hollowed out a pool. The bottom of that pool was absolutely smooth rock. And the water in it was quite cold, too. We used to try to swim in it, but it wasn't quite deep enough, really, to swim. It was only about perhaps 2.5 feet deep. But we used to go down there for picnics, and that was a lovely spot. And then we'd come, when we didn't have a car, we kids would go down through what was then Joe Elliott's place, that's where Ernie Paulus lives now, and the big house is at the front, and then there's what is like a road goes back to a house at the back, and we'd go back to the back there, and then we'd cut across the fields. I remember there was a big rock back in there. It was, it would be 4 or 5 feet high and 7 or 8 feet long, as I remember now. Maybe I exaggerated in memory. But we always said that was a meteor which had landed there. I don't think it was, but we thought it was. So it was, and we used to go back there, and there were springs where you could get water, and it was a lovely place. I remember once, I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, that George talked me into running away from home, and we loaded down a big bucket with all kinds of supplies. I think we had enough lard to last for 6 months, and not nearly enough matches, we found out. But we got up way early in the morning, and we took off for Shanty Falls, and we were down there. I think we stayed till 10 o'clock in the morning, and long enough that we were quite surprised the folks weren't bothered to look for us. They figured we'd be back. Well, then another thing happened before we moved to town. That was when I was a freshman in high school. There was an evangelist came here. His name was Bulgin, B-U-L-G-I-N. And he built a tabernacle, as he called it, down between Miami and Wabash Street, just
This is part 5, September 18th, 1974.
Well, Bulgin built this so-called tabernacle. What he did, he got rough lumber, and he built a building down there. And I don't know how many people it held, but it held a lot of people. And he had meetings down there afternoon and night for several months. And as I remember, Don Nixon had bought the Plain Dealer at that time, and he was very much opposed to Bulgin, and he was running an article every day about what an evil man Bulgin was. And as a result, Bulgin was doing a land office business, and he was putting it on the basis that either you were for him or you were for the devil, and the devil, I think it was Mr. Nixon. But he had enormous crowds down there, and he was taking in a great deal of money. My folks were quite interested in Bulgin and his evangelism campaign. I remember Howard Cadle from Indianapolis, who had built the Cadle Tabernacle in Indianapolis. He was quite a high-powered evangelist down there. He came up to help Mr. Bulgin. I don't know whether to help him get the money or help him spend it. But anyway, he was here too, and my folks invited them to come out to our home for dinner. That was over there on the south side. I remember they came out there, and they drove Mr. Cadle's $15,000 McFarland automobile. Now, I was just a little high school freshman, and I'd lived in the country all my life. And I wasn't smart enough to realize what the connection was between a $15,000 automobile and the Lord's work, which the people had been putting the money in for. And about 50 some odd years later, I'm not that smart yet. And frankly, it turned me off on evangelism. It turned me off on the evangelistic type of religion. I have never had any use for it since. I recognize, I think that some of the evangelists are good men. I think Billy Graham's probably a good man, but it's not for me. I remember Mr. Bulgin and Mr. Cadle, and I can't go for it very big.
Hey, John, maybe Don Nixon was smarter than you give him credit for.
Well, I don't know. I didn't say it. I didn't give Mr. Nixon credit for being smart, but I don't know. Maybe they were in cahoots. About the next thing that was very important in my life, I've tried to emphasize how my dad tried to get away from the selling on the road. In 1922, he finally made it. He decided to run for county auditor. Now, I don't know just what year, but very shortly before that, they had done away with the county conventions and provided for nomination by a primary election. But Dad went to the county chairman and told him what he was thinking of doing, he was thinking of running, and the county chairman told him it wasn't any use, that it was all decided, that the party had decided that Mr. Ramey, now that was the father of Dr. Arthur Ramey and Lester, and it seems to me his name was Arthur too, although I may be wrong about that. But the party decided that Mr. Ramey was to be the nominee, and Dad might as well forget it, and Dad said, well, I'm going out to try to defeat you. So he ran for county auditor. And Ramey ran, and Valdy Freising, who was for many years the home loan after that, Freising was a very popular deputy up there at the courthouse. I forget which office, but he was a very fine man and very well liked. And then there was Farmer John Gibney ran, so the four of them were in the race. Well, Dad had been selling on the road. He'd been trained as a salesman, and he was a salesman. And he went out to sell himself to the people of Wabash County, and he did a top-notch job of it. He worked for, I don't know how long he did work, for 2 or 3 months he campaigned. When the votes came in, Dad won. He not only won, he not only got more votes than all the other three put together. Valdy Freising was second. I don't remember how many votes Dad had. Valdy had 1,200 and some, and Ramey had 800 and some, and Gibney had about 250. But when you added all three of those together, you could add the amount that Valdy Freising got to that, and Dad still had more than that. So he won quite decisively, and he was always very proud of the fact that he won all but 3 precincts. There were about 40 precincts at that time. He tied 1 precinct. He lost 1 by 1 vote and 1 by 3 votes, and that was a matter of great pride to him throughout his lifetime, and I think deservedly so. At any rate, the law was that the auditor's office was what we call a holdover office. He was elected in 1922, but instead of taking office in January of 1923, he had to wait till January of 1924. And he got a job as the county attendance officer for the schools during that year, and worked at that while he waited for this job to come, waited to take office. And it was in that time that we moved to 188 North Wabash Street. And I remember that fall of 1923 was my sophomore year in high school. And my dad explained to me that there's a certain amount of typing to be done at the auditor's office. And he said he never felt that it was wise to pay somebody outside the family to do something that one of the family could do. So he wanted me to take typing so that I could do his typing at the courthouse. Well, at that time, boys just didn't take typing. That was a girl's subject, and I kicked like a mule about it. And the interesting thing, my dad never said, you must do something. But he came about as close to it at that time as he ever did. He said, well, you either take typing or you don't eat at home. So I took typing, and there's only one other boy, Pete Ply, took typing. Of course, that helped some. But peculiarly, I thoroughly enjoyed the course, and I became an outstanding typist. I've always been a little proud of the fact I think I still hold the record out at the high school for the fastest typing for a first-year student. I got up to 125 words a minute, which is batting them off pretty well.
Who was your teacher?
Odette Needham was the teacher. Odette, and she was a good teacher. She was I always thought Odette was a fine woman. Odette Cancer it is now. I don't know whether you know her or not. But she was an excellent teacher. She taught shorthand and typing. And so I took it that year, and at the middle of the year, I started working for Dad down at the courthouse, doing the typing that was necessary in the auditor's office. And that was a wonderful experience for me. I got to know the people around the courthouse, and I got to know about how a courthouse works. Frankly, I got interested in government. I got interested in how it works, and I remember at that time. Now, it seems to me that all the officers were terribly old, but that may be my memory. I was so young that everybody seemed old. Of course, Dad was 50 when he took office, and Amos Smith was over in the treasurer's office. I don't know how old he was. He seemed quite old to me, but he might not have been more than 40. J.F. Park was over in the recorder's office, and Park was, I think he was up around 70. Jim Ross was in the clerk's office, and Jim Ross was he was a Civil War veteran, so he had to be 80. Had a little white beard, snow white hair. He got sick while Dad was up there. I don't know whether he finished the term or not, but there was a man from Huntington named Zellers who had been clerk up there who came down and took his place. And then the next year, Park was out, and Dave Freeze took office as the recorder, and he died before his term was over, and his wife, Ada Freeze, was a milliner, took the office as a recorder. One of the interesting gentlemen was William Cowgill, was county assessor, and he was there for a number of years, I think about 3 terms. Cowgill had lost both hands. They had a 4th of July celebration once, and he was to fire a cannon. It backfired somewhere and blew off both his hands right at the wrists. One of the amazing things was that man would pick up a pencil between those stumps, and he'd write with it, and he would operate a typewriter. He would pick up one pencil, put it in his mouth, and another between the stumps, and he'd punch the keys with the one between the stumps, and if he needed to capitalize anything, he'd reach over with the one in his mouth to push down the shift key, and he could type a lot faster than you would imagine. And I always had a great deal of admiration for Mr. Cowgill. I have no idea whether he was a good assessor or not, but he was a good man. A couple of others, Goldie Hartman was county surveyor, county engineer at that time. I can remember Goldie Hartman when they were building what is now Old Highway 15 up around the cemetery and out south. Goldie Hartman was an engineer in that, or he had something to do with the construction. I saw him working on it. And it's an interesting thing then that Goldie Hartman was on the state highway commission when they put in U-15, and he had a great deal to do with that. I always had a great deal of admiration for Goldie. He was a fine man, absolutely honest, and whatever he went into, you could bet on it that it would be well done. And he achieved a great many places of considerable importance in his field. Another one that I remember very well, he's a very popular man, I liked him, was Hoyt Summerlin. He was the sheriff. One thing I remember, now, I grew up with the automobile driver's license. I first drove a car when I was 8 years old. There was no requirement for any age, any license, or anything else. I remember going down Columbus Street one day. Dad put me over on his lap, and I drove the old Model T along at 8 years old. But I didn't really start to drive until I was 12. At 12, I remember we had a 1920 Dodge. We had it out in the field one day, and George showed me how to drive it, and I started it up, and I will never forget that feeling of exhilaration when you felt the power under you. And so I started to drive, and I've driven ever since. And Dad was very good about letting us have experience. I remember when I was 12 years old, we went to Eureka, Illinois, which is just this side of Peoria. And at that time, it was, I think, 198 miles. A little less than that now with the new roads, all gravel roads. And I drove over there, and I drove back at 12 years of age, so that I got a lot of experience driving. Well, you know, a couple of years after that, they passed a law that said you had to be 14 to drive, and I just made it. I was 14 when the law went into effect, so I was all right. But the next year, the law changed, and they said you had to be 16 to drive. But they put a saving clause in it that you could take a test before a law enforcement officer, and if he certified that you were capable of driving, then you could drive. So I'll never forget it. I'd been working around the courthouse for a year or two, and so I went up to Hoyt Summerlin, and I said, Hoyt, they say I've got to have a law enforcement officer certify I can drive. Will you come out and ride with me to certify that? He said, why, sure, John. And the office then was right back of the steps on the east side of the second floor there where the little courtroom is now. So we walked down those big steps and started around past the auditor's office to go out the north door. Old Ron Hoyt Summerlin stopped to look at me, and he said, Jesus Christ, John, I've been seeing you drive around here for years. What do I want to ride with you for? So we went up, and he certified that I was capable of driving. Now that might be a good place to tell about Doc Smith. I first heard that Doc Smith needed a driver. Bob Tersman, a boy a year older than I, was driving for Doc, and Doc fired him. Bob was 10 minutes late one day, and I knew why Bob got fired. I went around and applied for the job, and Doc took me on, and I was sure I wasn't going to get fired for being late. Well, what I'd do, actually, I'd go down, Ernie Rumpf, that's Augie's brother, had a kind of a candy store, candy kitchen place up there on the hill. Well, it was in one of those rooms where Doc Bickle and is now, and I'd go down there and mess around and I knew just how long it'd take me to walk around Doc. Doc was where he had the house where Hoover Minor Funeral Home is now. I knew just how long it'd take me to walk around there, and believe me, Doc and his wife always said that if their clock didn't say 12:30 when I stepped on the porch, they set the clock. In 2 years, I was late twice. One time, Doc had me out till 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was supposed to pick him up at 8 o'clock the next morning, and the alarm didn't go off, and I woke up at 8 o'clock, and I called him right away and told him. He said, well, get down as soon as you can. Another time was in the summer, and I was typing. I don't know what I was doing. What I was typing was down at the Chamber of Commerce, was then in the Indiana Hotel in the corner room there, corner of Market and Miami Streets. And I was busy typing, and all at once the phone rang, and it was Doc. It was 29 minutes till 11, and I'd been supposed to be there at 10:30. 1 minute later, he called me, and I said, oh, my God, Doc, I wasn't noticing the time. He said, I thought that was it. Come on up. So I went up. That was the extent of my being late. But Doc Smith was, he was tremendous influence on me. He was, I think he was the most courageous man I've ever been around. He was totally unflappable. I remember once I fell down in a snowdrift with him, and you'd think that would kind of excite me. He had no legs at all. I told, didn't I, about how he lost them?
Right.
They were all clear up at the as high as they could get. He weighed 110 pounds without legs, and I'd pick him up and carry him in my arms in and out, put him in the car, take him. I'd go around, pick him up at 12:30, and then I had to be back at school at 5 minutes after 2, so I'd drive until 2 o'clock. And he went out, he had a, well, I don't know whether I mentioned it or not, he was mayor after he lost his legs, and he always had to practice. I'd take him to see his patients between 12:30 and 2 o'clock every day.
John, did he practice out of the house then? Is that where his
Yes,
office was?
his office was in the house.
Yeah. And then you would go out and visit the patients from 12:30 till 2.
He had a wheelchair, and he had a little office there. Well, it was an office for Jack Miner for many years, same office. And I remember some things. There was one little slogan he had hanging up there, and I always remembered. It said, "Never explain. Your friends don't need it, and your enemies won't believe you anyhow." And Doc, he was an interesting guy. He kissed more women as a regular thing than anybody I have ever seen. Many of his patients, he would, lady patients, he would kiss when he went in, and before he left, he would kiss them again and go on out. Now that's...
What kind of a doctor was he?
He was a medical doctor.
I mean, was he good?
Oh yes, he had been a very fine doctor. Of course, he was 55 years old when he lost his legs, and I drove for him then until I went to college, and then he had another boy drove for him for a year or two. And then he retired. And by the way, John Ford told me a story one time. He said that one time he went out to some town in Pennsylvania. And he said, you know, that was the town where Doc Smith came from. He said they still considered Doc Smith as the local hero. And there had been a fire in a gas line, and somebody had to go down and turn off a valve, or it was going to blow up the whole town. And Doc went down and turned off the valve, and it blew up. He saved the town, but it blew up, and it took off one of his ears and a couple of fingers. Of course, a horse bit off half of another ear, and he lost another finger here and there. He was, but very handsome old man. He had a little white goatee and a mane of white hair, and there was an aesthetic look about, almost ethereal about Doc. I remember after he left here, he went up to Minnesota with his son. But one summer, about 1929, I was at home and I heard a horn honk and honk and honk out front. And I went out to see what it was, and there was Doc driving his own car. He'd fixed up a little, I don't know whether it was a Chrysler, or a small Chrysler, or a Plymouth, but he'd fixed it so he could drive it and handle it all by hand. And I went out and tickled death to see him. He said, John, get in. I want to take you for a ride. I've never forgotten it. Later, he died about 1943, I expect it was. I was pallbearer at the funeral. But Dr. Smith was a great influence on my life, and always an influence for good. It seemed to me that maybe all three of the men, that Dad and Cecil Mills and Doc Smith, the thing I got from all three of them was the importance of accepting responsibility. They never talked to you about it, but you just got the idea from all three of them that was it. Well, going back to the courthouse, I had the opportunity to get to know quite a few of the lawyers at that time. Herman Hipskind was a young lawyer, and I never will forget the old courtroom till 1943. It had a great high vaulted ceiling, and it just acted like a sounding board. I remember Herman Hipskin, when I'd be working down in the east office of the auditor's office, he was arguing to a jury. He was very loud anyway, and I'm quite sure you could hear him better down there than you could up in the courtroom because there's too much echo up there. But you could hear him perfectly down below. Well, of course, Herman was one of them. Walter Bent was a very active lawyer at that time. Walter was 50 years old when Dad went into the auditor's office. They were the same age. And up in Manchester was Lon Fleming. He was a little, I remember, a little white-headed fellow. There was another lawyer up there. I can't remember his name. Then one of the most interesting characters in the law around here was Ed Eikenberry. He was a little bitty fellow, about 125 pounds, with wispy white hair when I knew him. He's getting up in years. And very witty. He was a great storyteller and an excellent lawyer. He used to teach a Sunday school class at the Presbyterian Church. He was an ornery devil. He always said he taught him to do what he said, not what he did. But later he got elected to the state legislature, and he made a fetish that he was always there for a vote. One time he was incapacitated in some way, and he had him take him into the House of Representatives in a wheelchair so he'd be there to vote on an important issue. Of course, Frank and Howard Plummer were young lawyers, but very fine lawyers at the time. Let's see, there was Brooks. What was his first name? He was the great ditch lawyer of Wabash County. He was also a criminal lawyer. But I've heard it said that Dave Brooks handled the legal work for practically every ditch in Wabash County, and he made a great deal of money out of handling ditch work. He was a brother of Ben Brooks, who was here until much more recently, a father of Raymond Brooks, who practiced in North Manchester for some years and was killed in an automobile accident. I got to know Judge Switzer, talked to him a few times, never knew him well. I must have met Judge Hunter, who preceded Switzer. I know I carried his papers, so I must have met him, but I didn't know him as a judge. But those were some of the...
Were Coggles practicing lawyers in those days?
No, the Coggles were not lawyers.
They're not lawyers.
They were, well, now, there was a Coggle who was a lawyer far, far before that time. And he made a tremendous lot of money, and his son, I believe it was Kerry, said that if he ever had to work, he thought he'd promote railroads. Which he never had to work. Yeah. He had money enough to get along without it.
Yeah.
There was one old lawyer, and I can't remember his name to save my neck. And he was a highly interesting old fellow. He was very old at that time. But he had been a very prominent lawyer earlier, and at one time the story was that he ran for governor of Indiana. And the story which I heard was that when he was running for governor, he went all over the state. And everywhere he went, when it came mealtime, he would go in and order ham and eggs. And somebody said to him, "You must really like ham and eggs." He said, "I hate the things, but it's the one meal the hotels can't spoil."
Yeah.
Speaking of that, back in 1920, I went with Dad up to Columbia City. We came back one evening, stopped at North Manchester to eat. And I think the Cellar Hotel was the only place you could eat in Manchester. We went in there, they had one menu. I mean, you took the meal that they had for that evening. And believe it or not, that was about 1920. The meal they had was mice and milk. Mm-hmm. Now, it's amazing to us that would be it, but that was the deal.
Was Quincy Milner practicing back in those days?
Yes, Quincy was here. Yes. And I didn't know Quincy as well. Now, his brother Red, was fire chief at that time, and he was the great football player, and he had played with the WAA up until about 1912, was their outstanding star, and along the 20 somewhere, Red went down to coach the local independent team, and he decided to play with them, and so he'd play the first and last quarters. He couldn't play a whole game, but he could rest the 2 quarters and a half, and frankly, he made the young fellows look a little sick. He had a pot belly, but the way he twisted that through a line was something to see. And I graduated from high school in 1926. I was 16 when I graduated. I'd skipped a grade back, took 5th and 6th and 1, so I got out early. And George was at Manchester College, and he talked me into coming up there to take the summer school. George was always the great student in the family. Everybody said that George was such a great student. And he was. There was no question about that. But I was always a little amused and a little proud of the fact that every time I ever took a course with him, I got an A and he got a B. He'd take me up to Manchester, and he talked him into letting me take. I took a course in American history and one in an advanced literature course, and they didn't want to let me take it. I was just out of high school, and they said, "Well, this is for juniors and seniors." But they finally decided, since George would be in that course with me, and he was a top student, that perhaps he could pull me through. Of course, what happened? He got a girl on the string that summer. He not only didn't help me, he didn't even get an A himself. But I liked up in Manchester, so I stayed there and started in school there. I went just 5 weeks that summer, and then I started in the fall. And a very important thing happened to me at that time. I got myself really crippled up. I hadn't mentioned that I started hitchhiking back when I was in high school, and I hitchhiked all over. As a matter of fact, between my junior and senior years, George and I hitchhiked out to Niagara Falls. Now, that was almost all gravel road at that time, and it was 350 miles. I remember it was quite a trip. Well, about 3 weeks after school started, it was on September 29th when it was. I remember that well. Another fellow and I started hitchhiking from Manchester to Wabash, and 6 of the students came along, 3 fellows and 3 girls, in a
Part 6.
Well, they had no room in the car, so this other fellow and I got on the fenders, the front fenders, which was not bad. There was a Model T. We were getting along fine, and we drove down to where the old bridge, just before you get to the bridge right at the edge of Manchester on the old road. The bridge is out now. There's a mill there, and you had to come around a curve to your right. When we came around that curve, those fenders were weak, and they sank down on the tires, and he couldn't turn. And we went busting right straight ahead up into the mill yard. And my corner of that car hit another Ford that hit the side of this Ford parked there. It threw me over it and threw me down. It turned it over on top of me, and when they pulled me out, my right leg about 6-7 inches above the knee, it was turned at right angles. Yeah, they got me they loaded me up and took me to the doctor. It didn't hurt anything. It was pretty well anesthetized. I always laughed. Cecil Ann Jack, who was around here for many years, a very beautiful gal too, by the way, she ran over and picked up my shoe. The heel of the shoe was off. The sole was cut right down the length of it. There were 2 or 3 big holes in it. But she came over and gave it to me. They took me off to the doctor's office. I don't know what she thought I could do with it, but anyway, I got to the doctor's office, Dr. Beeman, and I suggested perhaps he ought to give me a hypodermic, which he did. And he gave me 3 times the normal dose. He gave me a half a grain of morphine, and they put me in an ambulance, brought me to Wabash. By the time I got here, I was pretty well out. But I had told him to call Doc Smith and tell him to be there, and I will never forget when they took me into the hospital. Here came Doc Smith in his wheelchair, wheeling up
to me. But he refused to do the work on me. He got Dr. G.M. LaSalle, that's old Bob LaSalle's father. And he did the work. They took me in. One thing I remember so well, I was out like a light, but I woke up, I was hurting very badly, and what they were trying to do was take off my trousers. And I heard somebody say, well, just cut them off. And that tickled me no end, because I remember just at that time they were George's trousers. But anyway, they set the leg there and made a mistake and set it overlapping, so that it was about 2.5 inches short, and left it that way. And it was about 2 weeks later they discovered that, and they took me down to the office and broke it over. By the way, they gave me chloroform. And any poor devil that has to take chloroform, I feel awfully sorry for him. That was the worst anesthetic I have ever taken.
Why?
You breathe it, and every time you take a breath of it, it feels as though somebody hits you in the head with an axe. It really does. It just boom. And then when you're through it, you are so awfully sick. But they decided to bring me home after that, and
Not to leave you in the hospital?
not leave me in the hospital longer. I'd been there 2 weeks already, and I was going to have to lie there. That was all. There was no advantage in the hospital, and even then it was what we thought was expensive. Not like now, but anyway, they brought me home, and the folks planned to put me upstairs in a room up there in the back, and I said, no, not me. I don't want to stay up there in a room. I'm going to be there for weeks. I'd have put me right in front of the front window where I could look out and see everybody go down the street, and gee, people were nice. People walked past and wave at me or drive past, and it was real nice. The only trouble was they set the leg wrong again, exactly the same way they had before. And it was Thanksgiving Day when I got up the first time, and I wasn't ready. I tried to stay up for Thanksgiving dinner, and it was too much. But very shortly after that, I was up, and I was running around with the leg 3 inches short, and the foot was paralyzed. I had what they call foot drop. It dropped down, and the knee was stiff. And I was always very angry about it, that Dr. LaSalle was going to leave me that way. He tried to tell him I was all right. And Dr. Smith was the one who talked to Dad. He felt it was against ethics for him to do it, but after all, Doc and I were pretty close. And he told Dad where to take me. He took me to St. Louis, to the chief of staff at the Shrine Crippled Children's Hospital there. And I wasn't eligible for the Shrine Hospital. I wasn't in it, but Dr. Abbott did the work, and I was down there 14 weeks. And I don't suppose I should tell too much about that. It was long. As I look back now, I had a whale of a lot of fun. As I think back, I realize that it was a terrible 14 weeks. I was 350 miles from home. The folks got down there once in the 14 weeks. That's all I saw them, and I was awfully lucky. I just gotten there, and they brought in a young fellow into my room. He was a year older than I. They brought him in for testing, and they told him he'd have to stay in bed until for about 3 or 4 days before the operation, and they said he could either go home or he could stay there. And his folks kept him in the hospital so he could have the same room with me. Never in my life have I been around such lovely people. The people who were so kind to a kid one whale of a long way from home. Clarence, his folks, I would have challenged anybody to have been able to tell which was their son and which was not. They treated me exactly the way they treated Clarence, and they told all their friends to treat it. You take something for Clarence, take the same thing for John. That was the way it was. The father was English and a diplomat. His position was head of the complaint department in the largest laundry in St. Louis. If you don't think he was a diplomat, you think again. And the mother was short, heavy-set German woman, just a touch of sarcasm. They were different as day and night, but they were wonderful to me, and I've always remembered them with. And I went to see them many times after that.
Did they re-break the leg?
Yes, they re-broke it, and This doctor invented a way to lengthen legs. As a matter of fact, he worked on several boys around here. I don't know whether you ever heard of Chevalier, who was an electrician here for quite a while. He had polio, and his leg grew much shorter than the other, and Abbott lengthened it. Abbott worked on Bob Lute's foot, which had been a club foot, and there were others around here he worked on. But he was considered one of the three best in the country. And I remember we went in to see him. I never liked him. As a matter of fact, I hated his guts. But there were things that he was a great doctor. We went in to see him. I'll never forget. He was a cocky sort of fellow. He told my dad, he said, "Yeah, I can fix his leg all right, but it's going to cost you a lot of money." Now, I'll never forget, as long as I live, I'll never forget what my dad said. He looked at that doctor and he said, "Doctor, we don't have a lot of money, but you fix that boy's leg if it takes the last dime, because one cripple in this family is enough." And he fixed the leg. And it wasn't an easy job. What they did, they put a pin through the bone below the break, and they fastened weights on it. They had me lying with my head about 2 feet under, 2.5 feet lower than my feet. So the pull, started with 40 pounds, and each night they'd put on, they'd take off a little, and the next morning they'd put on still more until they got it up to 60 pounds. And for 3 weeks I didn't sleep. It was rough.
What was a lot of money, John, in those days? What was his bill?
I'll tell you about that. I had after Clarence went home, he was there 3 weeks. I had a boy in there there was a little fat Jew was there. It was the Jewish hospital, by the way. An older man was there for 3 or 4 days. Then Lee came, and Lee had his feet operated. He had been a clubfoot. They had been operated, and he had them done again. He was there 8 weeks. I was there 14 weeks. No, he was there 11 weeks. 10? Oh, I forget. He was there a long time, but not nearly as long as I was. He was not in the operation,
I talked about taking typing, didn't I?
Right. Now we're going on part 7. Okay, now John, let's go back and go into your high school career, and I apologize for the tape. We lost about 30 minutes of tape on the last session that we went into.
Well, we'll not worry about that. Well, I started high school, let's see, I graduated in 26. So I started in the fall of 1922. At that time, we were living out on Pike Street, about 100 yards or so, 150 yards past the end of the streetcar line then, and what later was what at that time, for much later, was the city limits. My dad felt that the high school at Wabash would give us a much broader education than that at Linlawn, which was a very small high school and of necessity had very few offerings. And so I was sent into Wabash High School, as my brother George had been. And when I think back, I walked usually for the better than 2 miles to the high school. Of course, an old duck like me got to mention that. But sometimes we took the streetcar too. One of my memories of that, one day the streetcar was absolutely full of students going to high school, and Art Finkenbeiner was driving it, and Francis Mills, later Dr. Mills here in Wabash, hopped on the cowcatcher on the back and was riding merrily along. And between Vernon Street and Wabash Street, Mr. Finkenbeiner slowed the car down to where it was going rather slowly and picked up the switching iron and threaded his way back through all the students to the back end, opened the window and hit Francis Mills on the fingers, and he went off, and I remember he spread-eagled on the tracks and his knickers were badly messed up. That's one of my memories of that. We used to walk to school, and then we would carry our lunch and eat it to school. The school at that time was terribly crowded. The assembly room had been made into 4 classrooms to try and take care of the overflow. We went down to the Eagles Theater for convocations, which we had once a week, and the whole high school would march down to the theater and have the convocation. We said that we had a great football team at that time, partly because the boys got a lot of experience bucking the line, trying to get through the halls in between classes. And it was a very serious situation. Now, trying to think back, some of the teachers, and some of them had a great influence on me, certainly. One of my favorite teachers, and one of the nicest ladies that I ever knew. I don't think she was the greatest teacher in the high school, but she was a good teacher. And that was Ruth Jones. Ruth was a rather heavy lady, very quiet, soft-spoken, as kindly could be, and as I say, she would not compare with some of the teachers we had were really among the greatest, I think, and I don't think Ruth would be up to that, but she was a very fine teacher, and one that I wouldn't want to leave out. I think she was one of my great favorites. In the first year, I had beginning Latin under Cornelia Blaney. And anyone who ever had Miss Blaney knows that she was a strict taskmaster. She was tough as nails. But when you got through Cornelia Blaney's class, you knew that you had learned a lot of Latin. She was one I would consider a very great teacher. I remember one boy was in my class. Well, maybe I'd better not say too much about that, because he wasn't too smart in anything except Latin, and yet he was a star Latin student. He's still around town. Maybe better not mention him. But she was a great teacher. Then Bess Bear in mathematics. Now, Bess Bear was an extremely great teacher for the gifted student, for the student who had high abilities. Bess Bear could teach him mathematics all he could hold. On the other hand, I don't think she was particularly good for the weak mathematics student. And I thought the high school did a beautiful job of dividing up. Nobody ever seemed to realize it, but some way or other the good students got to Bess Bear's class, and the poorer students got to Leewell Carpenter's class, who was also a great teacher. Particularly, he was good for the one who was not gifted. And it takes a very gifted teacher to teach those. And I think Carpenter did an unusually fine job of that. I don't believe I ever had him in class. At that time, I came to like Mr. Carpenter. I came to respect him very, very highly because of his reputation and because of the contacts I had with him outside of class, but I didn't have him in class. Then I was trying to think who else I had in history. I believe I had Catherine Troxell the first year. I had her several years in high school. I had her at Linlawn as a 7th grade teacher, but she had been going to school, and at that time, I think unfortunately, the high school teacher was considered much superior, and all teachers tried to qualify to teach high school. Catherine Troxell was a fine teacher when I had her in the 7th grade, and she was a very good history teacher. I had a great deal of respect for her. I can't think what the other course let's see, English. Perhaps that was it. Another teacher that had a great deal of influence on me. I always liked him. I don't think he would be in the class as a teacher with Cornelia Blaney or Bess Bear, but Tewksbury taught English. He taught public speaking. Tukey was from, I believe, Vermont, and he had a Vermont accent, which we always enjoyed. He had many rather odd habits, or one thing, when he would be standing thinking, he would stick his tongue out of his teeth, but underneath his lips, and it made him look very funny. And we always were amused at the way he would, as we thought, fail to pronounce an R. He gave it the New England, but we always liked to hear him say "thutty." But Tewksbury was a good teacher and had a great influence on us. And of course, Tukey was here for many, many years, and he still comes back. He must be up, I would suppose Tukey's getting up close to 90 years old now, and he's still quite an old boy. And he had two sons. One of them was a very great athlete, one of the huskiest lads I've ever seen. But Tukey was one of the greats. Odette Needham I had in typing and shorthand, and she was a favorite of mine. I think I was a favorite of hers. I took typing, and I think I told about that before, that Dad telling me I had to take typing and suggesting I wouldn't eat at home unless I did. And I was one of two boys in the typing class, and I think that Miss Needham, Mrs. Cancer it is now, I think she liked to have some boys in the class. Next year I took shorthand, and I did miserably in shorthand. I didn't work at it. And she got quite disgusted with me, and as a matter of fact, she was the only teacher I ever had that flunked me. She flunked me 6 weeks, and I remember that quite well, because at that time, if you passed all your grades, you got your report card at school, but if you flunked something, it was sent home. Mm-hmm. And I went to get mine and found that it wasn't available. And I knew it was being sent home. Well, now the mail carrier got to our home at exactly 12 o'clock every noon. We could count on the mail being there. And by running from the high school at Cass and Wabash Street to home at Maple and Wabash, 4 blocks, by running I could get there before he did. And so every day for about a week, I was sitting on the front step waiting for the mailman, and each time I was disappointed that he didn't bring my grades. And after about a week, one day I was at the office, and Dad said to me, "John, about a week ago, I got a letter," and he had gotten my grades, and I had an F in shorthand. And he had been watching me run home every day to try to intercept that letter. But I didn't deserve an F. I was better than that. But she was trying to teach me a lesson, and I'm afraid that it was lost. I never did any good in shorthand. Sometimes I think I regret it, and sometimes I don't. But she was another teacher that was important to me. Mr. Magner, Phil Magner Sr., certainly he was one of the very greatest of teachers. He taught science. He taught to us it was chemistry and physics, although I did not take chemistry. I only took physics, the only science I took. And Mr. Magner did a wonderful job at that, although I recall one thing when he and I had it out, he told us that if we would build an electric motor which worked, we would not have to take the final examination. And everybody was working on the electric motor except me. I was going around helping all the girls to build their electric motors and doing everything except building an electric motor of my own. And it went on until the night before the electric motor was to be turned in. And I went home, and I suddenly realized I'd better get to work on an electric motor in a hurry, which I did. And I got one that it looked very, very bad. It was a jerry-built thing, but it ran just like an electric sewing machine. It did a beautiful job, and I took it in and turned it in to Mr. Magner the next day. And I remember he looked at me and he said, "John, who built this motor for you?" And I said, "I built it myself." He said, "I don't believe it." He said, "You have been going around this class for the last 4 weeks and haven't done a thing toward an electric motor. Now at the last minute you bring one in." And I said, "Well, Mr. Magner, I built it last night." And I don't know whether he believed it then or not. Of course, he and I got along usually pretty well, although he and my older brother, George, had had it out quite a number of times. George was not always the best forerunner to have. He was obstinate, opinionated, an exceptionally good student. He read everything in the library. I think he did. He had to have them send to the state library to get anything new to read. But I remember one time he had it out with Mr. Magner. Mr. Magner decided that the chemistry class should clean up the laboratory. And he assigned George the job of washing the windows. And George informed him he was there to learn chemistry and not to wash windows, and he didn't propose to wash any windows. So Magner kicked him out of school. And Magner told me about it later. He said the next morning he got a call to come up to the principal's office that Ward Beauchamp was there and wanted to see him. And he said he was rather quaking in his boots because he thought Dad would be highly incensed that George had been kicked out of school. He said he got up to the office and Dad came bounding across the room at him with a ferocious look in his eye, stuck his finger in his face and said, "Mr. Magner, don't you ever let that boy back in class until he washes those windows." So that was the kind of support that a teacher could expect from Ward Beauchamp, and also from my mother, Cora. I always knew that if I had trouble at school, I was going to have trouble at home right along with it. But another teacher who had a very high reputation, now she did not impress me as much as she did most people, but I think that was perhaps my own fault. But Stella Moore had a reputation as one of the greatest social science teachers that this school ever had. Now when I was there, she was getting a little older, and it may be that she had slipped some. I never saw that she was as great as most people said she was, but she must have been. Everybody else thought so, and so I was in a very small minority. Some of the other teachers that were, one was Billy Tom, who was the coach during my last 2 years in high school, and I was interested in athletics. I wanted to be an athlete. At that time, I always blamed my lack of athletic ability on the fact that I was younger than the others. I had done the 5th and 6th grades in 1 year, so I was a year younger than the youngest in the class. I graduated from high school when I was 16 when I graduated. As a matter of fact, I was in college when I was 16. But when I look back on it, I know, of course, that my age didn't have anything to do with it. My trouble in athletics was that my left foot never knew where my right foot was, nor my left hand and right hand. I did try to wrestle, and I was the second best at all times in the 135-pound class, which was not good enough by any means. I remember some things about it. I remember one day Billy Tom was supposed to wrestle. He wrestled professionally, and they used to have great crowds here in Wabash to watch him wrestle. And he was to wrestle a Nick Caravas, who was billed as the world's Greek-style welterweight champion. And in the afternoon, Mr. Caravas came down to the old gym, and we wrestled in a room up halfway up the hill between the top floor and the gymnasium floor. Caravas came in and he asked Tom if he could work out with one of the boys. And Tom said, "You wouldn't hurt a boy, would you?" And he said, "Of course I wouldn't hurt a kid." So Tom had him work out with me. And we started in by pulling necks, and we pulled necks a while, and suddenly I got a chance to get him off his feet. Now in high school wrestling, that was extremely important, was to take the man off his feet and get in behind him. In pro wrestling, of course, they didn't pay attention to that. When they got off their feet, they went to work. So he very carelessly stuck a foot out where I could grab it, and I lifted him up, and I slammed him real good. And I don't know what happened in the next, I suppose, half a second. But the next thing I knew, I was further off the floor than I had ever dreamed I could have been, and I will say, frankly, he could have killed me. Instead of that, he dropped me down. As halfway down, he caught me and laid me down on the floor, and I got up, and we started pulling necks. I don't know what I learned, but I've always figured it was one of the better lessons I ever learned. Billy Tom was quite a character. He was a very handsome man. Most of the boys loved him. He was a great football coach and a tremendous wrestling coach. He was no good as a basketball coach, and it was while he was there that we got a separate basketball coach because he didn't know anything about basketball. He wanted to spend his time on wrestling in the summer. He had a tremendous. He had I think he was here 3 years. He had tremendous football teams all 3 years. His third year, we played Gary, and everybody knew that the Gary game would decide the state championship. That was the year after I graduated, and we were in fighting for the state wrestling championship, and had a number of wrestling champions. Back at that time, shortly after that, the carnivals used to come to town. When they got to Wabash, they always had a wrestler. They offered $50 to anyone who could stay with him for a certain length of time. And everybody went down because the high school kids, not only Cubby Nee, who was a heavyweight, but George Ross, who was weighed in at 147 pounds, and quite a number of the fellows go down there, and they'd pitch the carnival wrestler all over the mat. And people wondered why they spent the $50 a night and didn't notice that the crowds were bringing in hundreds of dollars every night to see the high school boys beat the wrestler. I remember some of the athletes that I liked particularly. Sandy Austin, he came here. I always kind of thought Sandy was, somebody got his father a job so he'd come and play football because he was a wonderful fullback. Sandy's out in California now. Scanty Ferguson, pound for pound, he was one of the greatest football players that ever lived. He only weighed 127 pounds, but he was a quarterback and a safety man, one of the very best. And Leroy Woods, George Woods, I could name a lot of them. They were a great bunch of fellas. Horst Showalter was one of the finest men I know. He's president of a bank down in Muncie now. Did I tell about the time they went up to Culver?
No.
That was the year after I graduated. We had a very great mile relay team. As a matter of fact, they won the state in the mile relay, and they went to the national meet in Chicago. And they had two sections, and Wabash won one section of it. So they were a great mile relay team. The next year I roomed with Verl Davis, who was one of the boys on one of the members of the team. And he told me how they went to Culver for a dual meet one day. And believe it or not, the Culver Military Academy sent word to the dressing room that they would not run against George Wood because he was a Negro. They suggested that they would have our mile relay team run against time, and then their mile relay team would run against time, and they would compare the times. And the coach brought the word back to the dressing room, and Lee Scholler, who was the anchor man on the relay team, and a great leader of boys, a very fine young man, got to his feet, and he said, "Hell, Coach, they're too goddamn good to run against George. They're too good to run against me. Let's go home." And the boys went home, and I expect if you knew George Wood and asked him about it, he would remember that. Mm-hmm.
How about discipline in high school in those days? Who was a disciplinarian and so forth?
we had a lot of disciplinarians. Discipline generally was very good. I should have mentioned one of the, a man in whom I just had a tremendous respect for was M.C. Darnell, the principal. And he was a disciplinarian. You never had any question about it, and yet it wasn't a mean type of discipline. It was, we respected him, and what he said went, and he was fair. And that meant a great deal. Now, one thing I remember with Darnell, for a while some of the boys got to dressing up too much, to spending money on clothes, and a lot of the fellows who didn't have money felt they just didn't feel right, and Darnell went to some of the fellows who were leaders. Some of them had money, some of them didn't. But he got a fad started, and everybody started wearing denim trousers, overall trousers. And they could wear them over old pants or whatnot, and everybody wore the same thing, so it worked out very nicely. I just remember that as one instance. Phil Magner was a disciplinarian from the word go.
They used to paddle in those days, John? Or?
No, nobody was ever paddled. They kicked some out of school, but very few. They achieved discipline by respect. I don't know. I don't remember that I ever saw Bess Bear do anything more than she might have spoken sharply to somebody, but you never had any question about whether you were going to do what Bess Bear said. That was it. And same way with Cornelia Blaney. By the way, I might mention Bess Bear. She had an opening statement for each class. She prided herself on speaking very, very fast. And oh goodness, she could speak fast. But she would start out the class by saying, and I can't go as fast as she did, but she would say, mathematics is an exact science. The answer to a question is either right or it's wrong. If it's right, you get full credit. If it's wrong, you get no credit. 75 is a passing grade in this class, and that does not mean 74 and 7/8. And that was it. And we knew it. Many years later, Bess Bear, in her old age, she got a little bit senile. I used to see her on the street sometimes, and she always stopped to talk to me, and one question she always asked. Every time she would say, John, I wasn't too easy, was I? And I would look her in the eye and say, no, Miss Bear, you were not too easy.
Yeah.
She surely wasn't. Well, going back then, it was during the high school days that I worked with Dad, and I think we got most of that on the previous tape. There's one story I want to add to that because I think it taught me something. The county was selling $50,000 worth of gravel road bonds, which were the auditor, the treasurer, and the commissioners had the sale of them. They could accept a bid or refuse a bid as they wished. They paid 4% interest. I don't know I don't know how long they were for, but at any rate, the banks would bid usually about 8% bonus, so they were giving up at least 2 years of interest. This particular morning, I was typing back in the east room of the auditor's office, and a banker, I believe it was from Logansport, we'll say Logansport, but I might be wrong. I don't want to. I wouldn't want to label the wrong guy. But this banker came in, and he came in with Dad to the east room, and he looked at me and said, Ward, I'd like to see you alone a minute, please. So I got up and went out. And just a couple, 3 minutes later, Dad came stamping out on that crutch. And I knew by the way he walked that he was angry. And he was red up behind the ears. I said nothing, went back to work, and that noon we walked home together. And on the way home, Dad said, you know what that man wanted with me this morning? I said, no. He said, he told me that if his bank got those bonds this afternoon, there would be a nice something in it for me. Well, the word got around that afternoon is what happened. The commissioners and the treasurer and auditor met, and Dad said, now, gentlemen, before we open any bids, I want to say one thing. I will oppose this particular bank getting those bonds under any circumstances. And if the gentleman wishes to know why, I wish you'd go out and tell him that I said that if he would like to come in, I will be glad to tell him and to tell all of you exactly why I feel that way. And they went out and told him, and he turned on his heel and went back to, if it was Logansport. And they opened the bids, and I suppose it's poetic justice. His bank had the high bid. They would have gotten it, but they didn't.
I think we're about at the end of this
All right.
section of tape, John, so I'll turn it over here.
Of course, a great deal of the time I worked, we always went to camp at some time during the summer. Camp Shuila, and I think I told about Camp Shuila, did I not?
Yes.
And then a couple of summers in high school, I went to Epworth Forest, which had just started at that time. I remember one summer, I think it was the summer before my senior year, that there were 8 of us, and each one had access to a car occasionally. And so amongst the 8, we could get a car every day, and every day one would drive, and we'd all go to Lucan's Lake. Now, some of those cars were not very good, and the tires were quite poor. And we had organization. We almost always had one flat tire. And we had it worked out. Everybody knew exactly what his job was, and I don't think a flat tire would take, it never took as much as a minute to fix a flat tire. I remember one day we had our flat tire on the way, and I had not noticed the weather. It was extremely hot and humid. And as we got back in the car, somebody said, we're going in, rain or shine. And I looked up, and the black clouds were massing. When we got to the lake, we were in a terrible windstorm. We all went out, and actually we couldn't swim. We all got underneath the float. The waves on Lucan's Lake, believe it or not, were 4 feet high. Hank Watts went out on the diving board. He started to go out on the diving board, and the wind blew him off. There were 23 trees blown down in Rowan, and there at the lake, I know one car was blown out of its parking place and turned around, and we were in there pretending we were swimming. But we had a lot of fun, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there were girls in those days, the same as there are now. And I suppose I ran around with my share of the girls. Earlier, Halloween was quite an occasion. We used to do a number of things on Halloween. Over there on the south side, on Halloween or any other time, there was John, what was his name? I can't remember John's name. He was the South Side policeman, and he was pretty heavy set. I don't know how old he was. To us, he was very ancient. I expect he was 45. But we used to do things that would get John to running after us. And we would run ahead, and when we got far enough ahead, we would wait until he got close to us, and then somebody'd yell, "Here comes John," and we'd take off again. I don't know whether that happened more than a couple or 3 times, but in my memory it happened very frequently. Yeah. And there used to be Albert Hetmansberger, who lived down on the corner of the Yankee Road and the Mill Creek Pike on the southwest corner. He was one of those fellas that was perfect for kids to play jokes on. I don't know why. Some people just attract that sort of thing. And Albert used to raise his own tobacco, and I hope he always put out an extra stalk, because we always got a stalk, and we tried to dry it out. It was atrocious stuff, but we we used his tobacco and that sort of thing. We had fun. We went swimming. We used to swim a great deal down in Mill Creek, and actually the first time I ever swam anywhere else. That little pool down there, I don't suppose it was over 15 or 18 feet in diameter, and at that time the water was about up to your waist. Yet the first time I ever swam anywhere else, I went out to Lucan's Lake and swam across the lake and back. I thought nothing of it. Today I'd think it was crazy, but then we did that regularly. When we went to Lucan's, except the day of the storm, the first thing we all swim across the lake and then we swim back. But now one thing that I made money all the time I was in high school, big money for those days. And I had the sweetest tooth. I wanted candy, I wanted sodas, I wanted all kinds of things of that kind. And Ernie Rumpf used to have a little place across the street here from the courthouse. Well, it's where Dr. Bickle's office is now, and he had the north side of that building. And my bill at the end of the week, I always ran a bill there. And my bill would be around $5 a week. And $5 a week when sodas were a dime and cones a nickel, that was a lot of money. I used to get away with a lot of it. Now, one thing that I did, I think maybe it ought to be in this, I did a tremendous lot of hitchhiking. I hitchhiked for about 15 years. And to give you some idea that I wasn't just hitchhiking to school and back, there were 3 years of those. I kept track of how far I hitchhiked. I had a little black book that I put it down each trip. And at the end of 3 years, believe it or not, I had hitchhiked 54,364 miles. So I was... most of it, I suppose, was right around in the Middle West here. I did go as far east as the New England coast. I went as far west as western Kansas, Nebraska. I used to, after I was in, I hadn't gotten into the St. Louis yet, but after I was in the hospital in St. Louis in 1927, I had a girlfriend down there, and for 2 or 3 years I went down every 2 or 3 weeks. I'd hitchhike to St. Louis and see her. Now it started, I suppose, when I was about 14. I had a girlfriend then. She was up at South Whitley, and I took the Big 4 railroad, took the train up to North Manchester. But I found there was no train on the Vandalia between Manchester and South Whitley, so it was about, I think, 10 miles, 12, and I just started to walk across there, and somebody came along and picked me up. And after that, I did that more and more. I remember one, and anybody around Manchester would be interested. Once I was coming down from Pierceton, I got south of Sydney there, and here came the most dilapidated looking old Model T. It was all stripped down. It didn't have any seat, any windshield, just the motor out front, and sitting on the gas tank was Russ Michaels, known as Mike on the Loop in North Manchester, and that was my first. He picked me up, and that's the first time I got acquainted with Mike, and I knew Mike for about 50 years or more, and he's always been one of my best friends. I think he was the best friend of almost everybody in North Manchester. That's the way I met him. But when I'd finished my junior year in high school, there were 2 fellas worked for the Plain Dealer, young fellas, and they decided to take a hitchhiking trip through the West. And they sent back reports which were published in the Plain Dealer while they were gone. George and I thought that was a wonderful idea. And we decided we would like to take a hitchhiking trip, so we talked it over. And we decided to go to Niagara Falls. And in August of 1925, we left here and went to Niagara Falls. Now, it was practically all gravel roads at that time. And by today's standards, there was no traffic at all. Well, we got along pretty well all the way until we got to Erie, Pennsylvania, and I think the trouble was we got pretty dirty by that time. We didn't look too good. And it was much harder from Erie on in than it was before. I remember some of the rides we had. One guy over in Ohio on the way up to Hicksville, I believe. Excuse me. Remember this old boy picked us up in a touring car, and I was seated in the back. George was up front with him, but the old boy chewed tobacco all the time. And it was pretty much of a splatter gun operation. I didn't care too much for it. Another thing I remember on that trip, I'd always liked turnips. We walked in between. We didn't know any better than that. And we came to a turnip patch, and I slipped over and stole a turnip, I thought. It turned out it was sugar beet. I don't know whether you ever tasted sugar beet or not, but don't do it. I've never liked turnips since because of the taste of that sugar beet. But we got to Niagara Falls, and we were camping out. We were sleeping out, and we met a couple, or we met a family, and they brought us from Niagara Falls back to Fort Wayne on the front fenders of a Ford, and that was our first long trip. It may be interesting. It was 700 miles there and back. We made it in 5 days and saw the falls. And George spent $3.50, and I spent $3.60. I bought soda or something sometime when he didn't, but we had quite a time on that. And when you think about it, it was quite a thing for the folks to let us go on a deal like that. That winter, I remember, and there's a story in the newspaper about it. Bill Gray showed it to me just a few months ago. And I remember I went down, George was at IU, and I went down, I think it was in Christmas vacation, sometime, I don't know. I went down to see him and hitchhiked down there and back. I remember it got down to 15 below zero while I was there, and they were building the, what was then the new highway between Martinsville and Bloomington, and we had to go clear around by Spencer to get to Bloomington. But I remember what the newspaper article said. They asked Dad what he thought about it. And he said, "Oh, John's pretty lucky. He gets rides all right. He'll get along." And that was the way he took it. On the other hand, the thing that I never had any doubt about was that I'd better do it the right way or else, because if I went the wrong way on anything, it'd be over. I knew that. But you can tell they let me go just as I wanted to. Well, now hitchhiking, today they have some funny ideas about it. They think that back in those days everybody was gung-ho to give everybody else a ride. Nobody was afraid of anything. It was a quiet time. Don't kid yourself. They were just as scared about picking up hitchhikers then as they are now. The thing about it, to be a hitchhiker in those days, I don't know about it now. They don't seem to do it the same way at all. But I always considered it was a selling job. I had to sell somebody on the idea that he would like to pick me up and have me for company. Well, now the first thing, if you're going to sell, you want to see that your showcase is out in the right place. And very soon this idea of walking and turning around and thumbing anybody came along. I found that didn't pay. What you tried to do, you wanted to get a place. First, you wanted to be at the edge of town. You wanted to be far enough out that you could look and see these folks. You wanted to be in a place where you could see them as they came toward you. You wanted to see what you were getting. And you turned down lots of rides. You didn't take every ride that came along. If they didn't look as though they'd be driving fast, you just acted as though you were looking at the scenery. You weren't interested in them at all. If they stopped you, the first thing you ask, "Are you going to the next town?" And you'd know the town. Are you going there? And if they weren't going there, "Well, thank you very much, but I better wait here." And the other thing, you wanted it where they could see you for some distance. And you wanted them to know that you were trying to catch a ride, so they would look at you and tell that you'd have a chance to sell them. then you preferred to get it at a place where it would be easy for them to stop. Now, at that time, there were many square corners, and very often at the edge of town, you'd find a square corner. They'd have to come up, almost stop to make that turn. You stand just beyond the corner. You stand, contrary to what most people think, you never stand before the street light. You stand just beyond the street light. In the first place, many people resent it if you come up to them when they're stopped. Maybe it's the shooting sitting ducks.
Yeah.
But if you're on the other side, they have a chance to stop or not as they wish. And another thing, they're not going to be going through there to get afraid they'll miss the light, which they will if you're on the other side. But as they come, I think the main thing is in your attitude, how you look, how you act as they are coming along, how you dress. Now, I think in almost every time I went hitchhiking, I was better dressed than anyone I rode with. I liked to have clothes that you could see at a distance, that they were good clothes, that they a little bit on the flashy side, but not so flashy that they would detract from it. I remember one outfit I had, and I liked it better than any other. It was a plain brown jacket and very light brown trousers, almost cream-colored trousers. And that outfit, you could tell a mile away that was a good-looking outfit. It was an expensive outfit, and it made them think that that I would be all right. The other thing, when they're coming, I like to carry a Boston bag. That's a bag about 14 inches long and 4 inches wide, and a foot or so, 14 inches maybe high. I could get change of underwear and socks in there, and everything my shaving stuff, everything I'd need. And I had a pennant on the side of it from Indiana University. I preferred that very much to Manchester, the University of Michigan, because it was red and white, and you could see that for a long way, and you knew it was a college pennant. And it had a well, there was a fine look about it. Then as people come up, you always wanted to have a big smile on your face, as though you just heard a funny story that maybe they'd like to hear, or at least that you're a good guy, and you stick your thumb out with a big smile. And then a little thing, but it got me a lot of rides. If you see they're not going to stop, and you can tell when they're 50 yards away or more, I'd set the bag down, big smile, and wave goodbye to them as they went past. And you'd be surprised how many of them slam on the brakes.
Give you a ride.
I remember one time I was going down to Dayton, and at that time you went to Indianapolis to go to Dayton because the roads straight through were not good. And I was at the east end of Indianapolis there, and this fellow in a Model A coming along. Of course, Model A's, those were the favorites of the hitchhikers because everybody drove them fast. And I did that, and he stopped. And when I got in, he said, "I don't know why in the hell I stopped for you." He said, "I just passed about 4 different guys down here, and every one of them was cussing me when I went by, and when you smiled and waved," he said, "I stopped." So that's the way it went. I don't know whether... now, one thing that is surprising in those days, when cars, most of them didn't drive over about 50 miles an hour, and your averages would be much slower because you had to go through all the town. You had lots of square corners and that sort of thing. Yet it was amazing how dependable hitchhiking was. For example, I would go to St. Louis, and I would figure on 9 to 10 hours to St. Louis. It'd never be less than 9 or more than 10. It was just that's in the daytime. At night it's different. At night you take anything you get and be thankful for it because they can't see you at night. But there were 2 days that I remember when I hitchhiked 550 miles in one day. One of them was a round trip, too. That was from Chicago, Illinois. I left the YMCA in the morning. Downtown Chicago, took a streetcar out, west edge of town on 20. Hitchhiked to Waterloo, Iowa, 275 miles. Talked to a man there, and hitchhiked back that evening. I was in the YMCA at Chicago. The other time I'd gone to Kansas to make the wheat harvest in the summer of 29, I believe that was, 28 or 9. And unfortunately, it was the year when the combines took over, and all the bums from all over the North America were in Kansas to make the wheat harvest, and there wasn't any wheat harvest to make because they had no work for anybody. I went out there with a fellow, Bumbauer was his name. I never did know his first name. He was Bumbauer, and I knew him well for years. We went out together, and hitchhiked out there, and Bummy was a sign painter, and he had had some work in art, and he knew something about art. And we went to McPherson, Kansas, and a little town of Lindbergh, which was north of McPherson, 20 miles or so, was the home of a great artist named Franzine, and he attracted a school of artists around him, and they were very good. Well, we got to McPherson, and nothing to do. By the way, McPherson College was a sister college of Manchester, and I met a fellow there that I'd known in Manchester, and summertime, hardly anybody in the dormitory, so we went out there and found a room that had a bed with a mattress on it, and we moved in, and we slept on the mattress in the dormitory for the time we were there. Nobody knew we were there except a few of the boys. But we'd spend our time in a bookstore there in McPherson, which had a lot of paintings, many of them by the Franzine School. He was the one who invented this making pictures using a paddle to put the paste on, and if you got up close to the picture, you couldn't tell it was anything. You get back and it would be very beautiful. And Bummy gave me lectures about art appreciation and how it worked and so forth. And I felt that I learned quite a bit. But then Bummy came home before I did, and finally I got down to $1.50, and I got an afternoon's work in a flower garden, hoeing weeds at 30 cents an hour. It's 110 in the shade and no shade. And I made $1.50 that afternoon, and the next afternoon at 4:30 I had $2.50 left, and I said, it's time to go home. So I left at 4:30 in the afternoon. I remember I got up to Salina, about 60 miles. I don't know what time that was, 6:30, 7 o'clock maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I was on a corner there, and there was a filling station. I asked the filling station how far to Kansas City. I believe he said 257 miles. And with a sneer, he said, just a nice evening's walk. I said, well, I wish I could make it tonight. And it wasn't 2 minutes. I got a ride with a fellow in a Chevy Coupe, I believe. And he took me to Kansas City. We got there at 3 o'clock in the morning. He was kind enough to take me right through town and out to the east end, and I tried to sleep beside they were building an underpass under the railroad, but 3 trains went through, and there were lots of mosquitoes in that pool of water they had, so I got back on the highway. And at 1 o'clock the next afternoon, I was in St. Louis. That was 550 miles from McPherson. By the way, I looked up a boy I'd roomed with in the hospital. That night we had a date, and we were out till 3 o'clock in the morning. So the next day I slept rather late. It was long. I don't know what time it was, but it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I caught the streetcar out of downtown St. Louis, out part way to Collinsville, where I got out and hitchhiked. And I remember it got late on me. The time I was in Vandalia, it was dark, and I was standing beside a swimming pool, and some of the kids were kidding me about catching a ride. About that time, I caught one in Indianapolis. At Indianapolis, I stayed in the Plaza Hotel. I believe the Plaza was the name of it. Later, I found it was one of the better whorehouses of Indianapolis. Cost me $1. Anyway, the next morning, I got coffee and donuts and rode to Broad Ripple on the streetcar and got home with 9 cents. Well, that'll give some idea about the hitchhiking. Now, we didn't get the... I did, in a former table, mention about getting my leg broken.
Yes. Now, but I want to know, you're getting ready to graduate from high school. Let's go back a little bit.
All right.
You're graduating from high school and how you decided to go to college and why and so forth.
Well, as far as going to college, there was never a question about that. It was...
This was a family decision? Or?
There was no decision. It was just, in my family, it was always... nobody ever said if you go to college. It was when you go to college this or when you go to college that. Mm-hmm. And nobody ever thought of anything different than that we would go to college. I graduated from high school, and George had gotten 2 years. He was teaching and going to school in the summertime. And I thought very seriously of going to DePaul because quite a number of my friends went to DePaul. But George was going up to Manchester to summer school, and he suggested I go up there with him for the one term. And so I went with him, and I remember he suggested I take 2 courses. One of them was a very advanced course in literature. The other was a freshman history course. And the dean thought it was just crazy to put a 16-year-old kid in this advanced literature course. But finally he said, well, your brother's a top student, and maybe if he helps you, you can make it. And so he let me take it. But George had a girl up there he was chasing all summer. He didn't work too hard. Anyway, I got an A. I got an A in the advanced literature course. He got a B, and I always remembered that.
Yeah. Who was running the college in those days, then? And what was the college like?
Otho Winger was the president, and Schwamm was the dean at that time. Now, that was the last summer he was there as dean. He left that fall to go as President McPherson. He was the President McPherson when I was out there on the hitchhiking trip. But Otho Winger was, if ever I knew a great man, he was it. He built Manchester College. There is absolutely no question about it. He was an organizer. He was an administrator, and he was a wonderful man. One thing was too bad about Otho. He was not very old when his wife died, and he became senile just all of a sudden. And many people remember Otho Winger after he was senile. It was too bad because he was such a very great man originally. Some of the people there that were outstanding, of course.
John, let me finish this tape here and put another tape in before we get on to that Manchester story.